Hello, punks. It's time to reward you for your patience with some new tales of competitive Warhammer the Old World. Not just one battle report, but 5 as I take a new generation of Bretonnians to the Triple Crown Grand Tournament. I realize I've been cruel to you. You've been hungry, thirsty, angry. Good! I've been angry too. Angry at the great dictator's flaccidity as he offers up only the merest handful of new models, while continuing to flog the rediscovered golden mule of Warhammer Fantasy, which, lest we forget, he was only too happy to send to the Knacker's Yard in 2015 on the spurious grounds of wanting space for creative freedom to explore the mortal realms. Oh, and what a great argument that was! Think of the potential things we could build on the charred remains of the great library of Alexandria. What wonderful tweakments we could make to the Sphinx now we've torn off its nose. What cleverness is now possible now we've levelled the House of Wisdom of Baghdad. Yes, punks, history is doomed to repeat itself as small men destroy mountains of the past to make space for their molehills and make themselves look bigger. So, we sail into uncharted waters with 2 separate hands on the ship's wheel. One is the vice-like grip of brilliance of the past, and the other is the hegemonic but undefined force of modernity. I tell you, punks, neither the past nor the future is any good to the man on the tiller at present. Where is he steering us? To El Dorado? Or into an iceberg? All I can say, punks, is this. I predict a mutiny. But before you grab your sawn-off shotgun or your cudgel and storm the captain's cabin, listen carefully. Right, so before I tell you my army, let me just say a few words about what Bretonnia are like in competitive Old World. Now, of course, these are competitive battle reports, and I am fighting to try and win my games by as large a margin as possible. Now, of course, competitive play is not the sum total of what Warhammer Fantasy should be. For some players, it's not even a small part of what it should be. But this is a tournament, a large tournament, and one I know well. Many of the players who attend this are competitive players, and they will be expecting me to bring something strong, and they're going to give no quarter in return. Thus, while I think there's a place in the world for both, these 5 battle reports are stories of filth, not fluff. Now, of course, in a tournament, you need to be able to take on all comers over 5 rounds. You need to be able to deal with elite Chaos Warrior heroes, sneaky Goblin fanatics and war machines, big attritional blocks of skeletons, or dwarf gun lines. Now, if you go back over all editions past, it's often those armies that can do everything that tend to do well. They can fight, they can shoot, they're manoeuvrable, they've got reasonable leadership, they've got good magic. This is why an army like High Elves over the years has tended to be so successful. Extreme armies, on the other hand, tend not to do as well in these tournament situations because they can win some games heavily and can't really do that well in others. Bretonnians traditionally are absolutely in the second category. If you get a good matchup, you can absolutely ride them off the field and get huge wins. But against difficult opponents like vampire counts or demons where you can't break the enemy, sometimes Bretonnians really struggle. But of course, and this is the phrase that I'm going to use several times in this video, that was then and this is now. Now we're in the old world and things have really changed. Perhaps the biggest difference from 8th edition that really comparatively now advantages Bretonnians, I think, is that 8th edition wasn't a Hero Hammer edition, and it was also not a good edition for heavy cavalry. But now in Old World, we've got the most Hero Hammer edition of the rules ever produced, which quite frankly make even 4th and 5th edition look like licorice all sorts. In Bretonnia, as absolutely befits our lore, we have some of the strongest individual heroes, some of the mightiest warriors ever to grace the Warhammer world. Also, the real traditional nemesis for heavy cavalry from the past, and especially in 8th edition, was infantry. So in Old World, infantry is slower, there's no second rank fighting, there's no step up, the maximum rank bonus is capped at less. Infantry are absolutely terrible in this edition of the rules outside of tar pits. Now, that massive downgrade that infantry have suffered hasn't applied to heavy cavalry. We're still about as good as we were before. Now, one other change in the rules which seems more marginal but has absolutely massive implications for Bretonnia is that single characters who are not on monsters get 360-degree line of vision. Not only have Bretonnians got individual Pegasus heroes, they've also got Pegasus Knights. We've got some absolutely first-class charge threats that can't be hidden from because they've got 360-degree lines of vision. You can have it so the enemy can't charge you, but you can charge them. Man, this is hard to hide from, especially when you consider it all goes super fast and it's got countercharge, even if your enemy does manage to get the slip on you. So in summary, many of the changes to the core rules in Old World have benefited Bretonnians enormously. We've gone through more than a decade of the last edition of the rules greatly disadvantaging us compared to what we were in 6th and 7th, but what's gone around has come around and the boot's now on the other foot. I think the army that I'm about to show you is absolutely lethal. I'm not saying there aren't better things than this in the game, but it feels more powerful than anything I've taken to a tournament in 8th edition for years. Remember, there's no comp system in Old World. A comp system is simply something that attempts to penalise you for taking filthy things and reward you for taking softer things. In Old World, this obviously hasn't really developed yet because the game is just so new. So really, if you talk about it from a purely competitive perspective, it's a question of bringing the filthiest thing that you possibly can. So let me talk about the filth that I've brought. So let's deal with the units first. So I've got the minimum spend here on core, which is again something you'll see in most competitive Old World lists. Now Bretonnian core in my view is amongst the best of any armies in the game. We've got Knights of the Realm who are an excellent basic knight. What makes them excellent? Well, they've got the Blessing of the Lady, even though they're a basic knight. They can counter-charge, which means that I can declare a charge in response to yours, which isn't something that many core cavalry have, and they can also use the Lance formation. Now, the Lance formation has been vigorously debated in Old World, both because I don't think it really works from a mechanistic playing perspective, but also because it doesn't really seem very good. 6 knights in Lance formation charging actually get less attacks than 6 would in a line. However, I slightly dissent from this critical opinion here from a change. I actually think the Old World Lance formation does have some uses. First of all, you can cram more knights into a smaller area of table and bring more of them to bear in combat. Sometimes you can get 2 units in rather than 1. Secondly, these lances are also easier to wield, so they're more agile. Good as these Knights of the Realm are though, I can't see any justification for taking more than the minimum I'd need to fill out the core, because other choices are much better. In addition to the Knight Wedges, 2 of 6 and 1 of 5, they full command on each of them, I've got a Peasant Bowman block. You're forced to take 1 unit of peasantry by the rules, and I think the skirmishing peasant archers, rubbish as they are probably the best on offer. Right, moving into special, we've got 2 units of 3 Pegasus Knights with full command. These have had a massive upgrade compared to what they were before. They've got Furious Charge, giving them another attack on the charge. The riders have also got Strength 4 instead of Strength 3. And more than any of that, they've got a 360-degree vision arc. When a unit of 3 Pegasus Knights charge, you're getting 7 Strength 6 attacks from the riders and 6 Strength 4 attacks from the Pegasi at good initiative. They've also got countercharge. I find a unit of 3 Pegasus Knights operates in a very similar way to a single hero. They've got similar stats, similar maneuverability and similar damage output. The next part of my list are 3 skirmishing units of Squires. 2 of them have got Scout and 1 of them hasn't. Now, this is the only choice in my list that I think is probably a bit more arguable. Squires are just men with longbows, there's nothing special, but because they've got Scout and because they've got Skirmish, they can run around and get in the way. Right, now it's hero time, and this is where the real power in Warhammer the Old World lies. I've spent almost exactly half the points in my army in heroes, something that you're going to see in more or less each and every powerful competitive list. Right, let's start with Claude Vollier, the young Duke. This is the man here in black. Black because that's usually all his victims see after he's finished with them. So, the generic Bretonnian Duke is one of the best lords in the game. There's been a lot of herding, I think, with the lords. The Chaos Lord, the Dwarf Lord, the Bretonnian Duke, the Elf Lord, they all actually now have pretty similar stats. But it's not his stats that make him amazing, it's really his magic items and virtues. So he's got Virtue of Heroism, which I think is one of the best ones in the book. The Virtue of Heroism essentially gives him what used to be called Heroic Killing Blow in 8th edition. That means he kills anything, except chariots peculiarly enough, on a 6, which means he's absolutely lethal. 1 roll of 6 to wound from me, and failed ward save permitting, off comes the opponent's head. Aside from this, he's got the Gromwell Greathelm. This gives him +1 armor save and also rerolls 1s to wound. That means he's 2 up rerolling 1, which is as good as it gets in Old World. He's also got another absolutely filthy item called Surian's Locket, which is only 25 points. This stops him taking multi-wounds. Cannons, Ogre Blade, Casket of Souls, all these things just do 1 wound on the Duke. When you consider he's got Toughness 5, 5 wounds, a 2-up save rerolling 1, and the Blessing of the Lady, he's incredibly hard to get through. He's also got the Grail Vow. This gives him magic attacks, immunity to psychology, and stubborn, which means he can choose to fall back in good order if one combat goes against him. Now, it's not just that this Duke is really good on paper, he's really good for the metagame. Consider that many, I may even say most players of Warhammer the Old World are going to hitch their cart to the dragon train. The dragons are amongst the most notoriously overpowered things in the game. Cannons don't stop them, magic doesn't stop them, shooting doesn't stop them, ranked up troops certainly don't stop them, and so really only 2 things do. Namely, other dragons or a dragon slayer. Because of this virtue of heroism, the Bretonnians have got the best dragon slayer in the game. The tournament circuit is a land populated by these huge winged serpents, and Claude Vollier is going to slay them. Right, next we've got the Green Knight. The Green Knight was an absolute favourite of mine in 8th edition, and he's even better than he was before in this. In fact, he's miles better than he was in 8th edition. The Green Knight is ethereal, so he can't be damaged by non-magic attacks. He comes back to life, and he also appears in terrain features and ambushes people. The Green Knight's stats and magic sword are better than they were before. He's got 360-degree line of vision. What really sours the milk, though, is the fact that he can charge in the same turn he's placed. That has absolutely devastating implications. Next, we've got our battle standard bearer Repanse. I've ruthlessly crowbarred her off a horse and stuck her on a Pegasus. She's got the virtue of the ideal, which gives her another weapon skill, another initiative, another attack, and another leadership, really upgrading her to similar stats to a Baron. She's also got a potion of foolhardiness to make her immune to psychology for 1 turn. She rides a Royal Pegasus, just like the Duke, and this monster also is nothing to say boo to. It's got strength 5, 3 attacks, and 2 stomps. Finally, we've got Fleur, my Prophetess of the Lady. She's a level 4 wizard on elementalism riding a horse. Note punks, that's just a mundane horse. This of course enables her to do reserve moves, which means skitting in and out of enemy dispel ranges. She's got no magic items whatsoever, simply because I couldn't cram them into my character allowance. She's running elementalism. There are 2 good spells on this lore, and that's about it. Those being Plague of Rust, which has a 21-inch range and drops the enemy armor save by 2 and can be cast into combat. There's also Wind Blast, which is a very useful magic missile, doing D3 plus 3 strength 5 hits and pushing the enemy backwards. She has access also to the Lady's Gift from the Bretonnian signature magic spells, which gives units a 6-up or a 5-up regen, which is also quite useful. Unfortunately, most of the other spells in elementalism are pretty useless, and so it's largely going to be hoping I roll Wind Blast and Plague of Rust and taking the Lady's Gift. Fleur's main purpose, though, isn't really to cast spells, it's to stop those of the enemy. In Old World, a level 4 wizard is absolutely compulsory. You simply aren't going to be dispelling anything unless you've got one. Fleur's rather boring and bureaucratic role is simply to sit in the middle of the battlefield and play the boring game of Old World magic phase coin toss and stop 50% of her opponent's spells. Right, so that's my army. Strategy-wise, I'm going to use Claude Vollier to try to run down any dragons that I can see. Apart from that, I envisage that my Pegasus Knights, Repanse and the Green Knight are going to do most of my fighting. My core Knight wedges are probably going to be weaker than everything except my opponent's core units, but if I stack them all together and I'm able to get 2 involved instead of 1, I think they might be competitive. Right, so I pack my army up and take the train down to Southend. The venue here is called Saxon Hall. Unlike many tournaments, this isn't being held in a specific gaming venue, but actually a conference centre. It's actually a really splendid venue. It's got its own bar and it's extremely spacious. It's also nearish to a couple of hotels, one of which I'm staying at. Now, Triple Crown is of course a long-running organiser of tournaments, and they've been running them in 8th Ed for goodness knows how many years. Perhaps surprisingly, a tournament of this size with around 55 to 60 players is around the largest Old World event I think I've seen so far in the UK. I must say that's something I didn't predict. I thought when Old World came out, there would be really big tournaments featuring hundreds of players. However, this simply hasn't happened. Most of the events are in small, highly localized provincial places, perhaps featuring maybe 8, maybe 12, maybe up to 20 players. Also, many of the guys playing aren't particularly competitive and are mainly just hobbyists. Therefore, the Triple Crown is probably as close as it gets to a really big event with around 55 to 60 players. Now, of course, many of the guys at this are what you would call the legacy 8th edition crowd. With many of these guys, I've got good gaming relationships and in some cases social relationships with them. However, strolling around the venue, it does become obvious that there are quite a few new faces here. I'm pleased to see some younger chaps. Perhaps they're playing Warhammer Fantasy for the first time and have no experience of previous editions. I also note there seem to be a few older guys here as well. Perhaps they played Warhammer Fantasy in the past and have got some very interesting and different ideas about the hobby. I'm always very interested by Warhammer anthropology, so hopefully I'll get a chance to play some of these new chaps, or at least at any rate hear their stories. Alright punks, so it's on to round 1. So my first opponent is Joby Bibby. Given I could have been drawn against anybody, this is a pretty difficult first round draw. In the good old days of 8th edition, Joby actually won one of the previous Triple Crown Grand tournaments, and so he's a very good player. We played 2 games before over the years, and both of them were very tight affairs. Now of course, like with the stock market, past performance is no guarantee of future success. Who was top dog in 8th edition doesn't really matter very much now. This is a new world. As we deploy our armies, I chat to Joby. He says he's only played about 8 games of Old World. That's considerably below me. I've played well over 50, and so I think I'll have the advantage here in terms of my knowledge of the rules. I also think I've got an advantage with the matchup. I know Warriors of Chaos very well because I play them myself. I also think that Warriors of Chaos, as they were in 8th edition, aren't a bad matchup for the Bretonnians. I think we've got some key advantages over them. We've got excellent combat characters that specialise in individual duelling, and of course, we've got the virtue of heroism. Warriors of Chaos also don't tend to have large infantry blocks or Death Stars, which Bretonnians might have to avoid rather than being able to take off. In some respects then, I actually think that this matchup is probably more similar to what it would have been in 8th edition than a lot of other games of the Old World. Anyway, looking at Joby's army specifically, well, he's got 4 units of dogs. That's pretty much what I'd do given how good they are in Old World. And then he's got a bunch of characters. Well, he's got a dragon in his list, and I think this is the first of many that I'm going to see. Dragons are, of course, the cookie-cutter meta in Old World. Everyone's running the damn things because they're so stupidly overpowered. But as far as I'm concerned, the more of those I see, the better. At the end of the day, I'll be fighting fire with water because I've got that Duke with his virtue of heroism. Now, this is only a Sorcerer Lord on a dragon, and so it doesn't have the combat potential that a full-on Chaos Lord would have. But I don't think that changes the fundamentals of the situation that much. It's unfightable for pretty much anything but my Duke. In the list, he's also got a Demon Prince, who is running level 3 on Dark Magic. The Demon Prince, I have to say, I think is pretty rubbish for Warriors of Chaos. He does have a 360-degree vision arc, and he's pretty good in combat, and he's got a 4-up ward, but man, I just don't rate him for the points, especially because he's also unstable. Needless to say, my Duke will be okay against him as well, because that Demon Prince has got the Ogre Blade, and my Duke's got Surian's Locket. That's another excellent matchup for the young Duke. I think he could be really quids in here. Aside from that, Joby's got a Giant, 3 Dragon Ogres, 2 single Dragon Ogre Shartaks, which are pretty much now the meta for Chaos Warriors, and 1 big unit of Forsaken. It looks he's got about 20-something there. Now, the big unit of Forsaken, with of course the Mark of Khorne, which is by far the best, which gives them hatred, could be a problem for the Bretonnians. Forsaken can, of course, on their random attack, get Killing Blow, and that'll go through knights like a knife through hot butter. That being said though, they're infantry, and infantry's garbage in this game. However, one thing makes them not garbage, and that's the demonology spell Steed of Shadows, which Joby absolutely has up his sleeve. As well as the Steed of Shadows, Joby's Demon Prince rolls up Demonic Vigor, Demonic Vessel, and the Summoning. Meanwhile, his Demon Prince gets Battle Lust, Word of Pain, and Soul Eater. He's got all of the nasty spells from Demonology and Dark Magic there. For her part, Fleur rolls up the Lady's Gift, Plague of Rust, Summon Elemental Spirit, and Windblast. So here's the deployment. It's pretty much as you would expect. The Chaos are concentrated in the middle of the battlefield, with their big monsters there in the centre giving themselves the maximum command over the battlefield and ability to influence it. The Forsaken there are parked in a wood, but as I say, I don't think they're going to be there very much longer and will be flying across the table with the Steed of Shadows from that Demon Prince. In all honesty, given I've got so many 360-degree vision arcs in my army, I don't actually find there's that much tactics to deployment. Because my dudes can pretty much see anywhere, I can really just dump them on the table, and they're so fast that they'll be able to rearrange themselves anyway. Now, Joby has actually paid for Vanguard on 3 of his 4 dog units, and so they're able to get in my face pretty much instantly. In Old World, I have to say, I don't usually tend to bother with this, because of course these dogs can go in marching column, and so they can pretty much get to your opponent in turn 1 anyway. However, purchasing them Vanguard does at least enable them to deploy in a conventional formation rather than a conga line, which means they can charge and also block more potential incoming charges. Joby's turn 1 sees him cast Demonic Vigour on the dog unit that's vanguarded up in front of the 2 knights. I don't think he expects that to do very much, but it's not as though he's got too many other great targets for these spells at this early point. By far the most decisive thing he does, though, is he gets Steed of Shadows off on the Forsaken, and they fly up really to within spitting distance of my own knights. It's a classic ploy, of course. I've got those dogs in front of my knights chaffing me, and then a unit of infantry coming up behind. It's taken a spell to accomplish that here in Old World, but nonetheless, Joby's successfully bringing some 8th edition pressure tactics to this new system. One thing he's most certainly afraid of, though, with his Demon Prince and his Sorcerer, is my Duke with his heroic killing blow, so he doesn't push as far forwards as perhaps he might ideally like, leaving the Duke just out of charge range. This is one of the things that these 360-degree characters with their massive charge range can really do, which is push your opponent around the table. If that Duke wasn't here, there's no doubt that Joby would have flown up these 2 Chaos characters to really put pressure on me along with the Forsaken. As it is, he's hanging back. So, on to Bretonnian turn 1, and in our start of turn phase, Fleur gets the Lady's Gift off on the Duke, and also Plague of Rust off on the Forsaken. I don't really expect either spell to be particularly consequential, but in Old World there's no resource management, and so you just tend to cast spells when you can, and don't think too much about the consequences later. Perhaps they'll be useful, perhaps they'll be irrelevant. My opening charge of this tournament is to use my Pegasus Knights in the middle to attack that dog unit that's blocking 2 of my Knight Wedges. The pooches decide to flee rather than being impaled by the elite Pegasi, but do so in a way that perhaps Joby had not anticipated and actually go in front of his Forsaken. Those dogs have done me a service there. They've just blocked that infantry block and prevented me from having to go and park my own chaff in front of them. My second big charge is the Green Knight. Yes, a piece that wasn't even on the table at the beginning of the game can appear in a natural terrain feature and charge in the turn that he appears. This is crazily overpowered, and I don't know what they were thinking when they wrote this rule. In 8th edition, the Green Knight could come on and then just move, and that was powerful enough. But in this, he can just charge. Even given that the organisers have limited each battlefield to only 2 natural terrain features, this gives the Green Knight amazing scope to influence the game. In this case, he decides that the best target for him is actually that dragon, and he thunders into its side. Now that Chaos Sorcerer on top the dragon will have a magic weapon of some sort, but he's only got 3 attacks, and the dragon itself, of course, will only connect with thin air when he tries to attack the Green Knight. I'm hopeful that our green friend can at least pin that dragon in place. That'll hopefully buy time for Claude Vollier, my Duke, to destroy the Demon Prince and then turn his attention to the lizard. So, for my movement, with those Forsaken neutered by those fleeing dogs in front of them, I'm able to push forward. My Duke, enhanced of course by the Lady's Gift, decides to be bold and simply flies forwards into the middle of the battlefield, daring whatever Joby has to charge him. Repanse, meanwhile, is a bit more cunning with her own movement and actually flies in front of one of those dog blocks. She can be seen by the giant, and that's a combat I'd prefer to avoid, but Joby's own chaff is giving me cover there, and there's no way the giant can fit in. My Pegasus Knights on the right-hand side of the board swoop round to give me excellent coverage. There's a Dragon Ogre Shartak looking at them, but if he charges in, I'll countercharge, and I think I'll come out the better of that. Meanwhile, my main blocks of knights really ham back. At the end of the day, it's the characters that are going to be deciding this battle, and so the knights might have some more auxiliary use at the end, but it's not their time yet. My own magic phase sees Fleur fail to get off Windblast or summon Elemental Spirit, but my peasant bowmen do manage to kill 2 dogs from the central picket line. That actually panics them, and they fall back in good order towards the Chaos lines. A little shooting here and there also sees me ping off a couple of Forsaken, augmented by that Plague of Rust. In the combat phase, I discover the loadout of that Chaos Sorcerer Lord, and he's actually got the Dragon-slaying sword. In a world dominated by dragons, putting a dragon-slaying sword on top of a dragon is probably a pretty good idea, but the problem is I've got no monsters. Against the Green Knight, that expensive piece of tinsel is going to do about as much damage as a toy lightsaber. So, the Green Knight chooses the extra strength and the multiple wounds 2 option, another augmentation from 8th edition, and tries to use it to kill a nasty Chaos Dragon. Unfortunately, he does no damage whatsoever, and the combat is a draw by dint of the Green Knight being in its side and the dragon having close order. That's not great from the Green Knight, but it is at least enough to lock that Chaos Dragon in place, which was his primary objective. So, it's Warrior's turn 2, and the agents of the Dark Gods have got some big decisions to make, because the Bretonnians are already in their face. First of all, Joby managed to cast Demonic Vessel on the Chaos Sorcerer, which he is allowed to do because that's got ranged self. Charge-wise, both of those single Dragon Ogre Shartaks commit to combat. One of them charges Claude Vollier, which is a bold move indeed. I think he's hoping that Claude's not going to show that Magic 6, and he can pin him in combat and save the Sorcerer Lord and the Demon Prince. The other charges the Pegasi on the right flank, and the Winged Riders elect to countercharge. I think I'm going to come off much the better there, and I'm hoping to be able to chop down that Doga before he even swings. Meanwhile, another big play from Joby is that the Demon Prince charges the side of the Green Knight. This high-ranking royalty of the Chaos Wastes has brought with him the Ogre Blade, the best magic sword in the game, and so he'll have an excellent chance of dispatching the Green Knight back to whence he came. However, for those with the handy advantage of being able to come back to life, as the Green Knight can of course do on a 4+, death may be but a minor inconvenience. For Joby's movement, he shifts round his main Dragon Ogre block. His dogs in front of my main Knight Wedges rally and reform themselves into a conga line. The other dogs in front of his Forsaken, as Joby hoped, don't manage to pass and continue to flee. However, they've done the damage because they prevented the Forsaken from charging this turn. In the combat phase, the Pegasus Knights, fighting the Shartak who countercharged into him, skewer the dragony beast at the end of their lances. They overrun into the centre of the board, ready to let the Shartak's Dragon Ogre buddies have it in my next turn. My Duke Claude Vollier is also fighting a Shartak. His opening roll of this tournament is hardly auspicious, and he only managed to wound the creature once. However, this is enough to win combat, which was the bare minimum I needed. The Duke sits there and has clear view of both the Demon Prince and the Dragon for hopefully a decisive charge next turn. In the Duel of the Heroes by the Wood, the Demon Prince unfurls his Ogre Blade and banishes the Green Knight back to the Spirit Realm. Into Bretonnian turn 2, and Claude Vollier spurs his Pegasus into a mighty flying charge on the Demon Prince. He's abetted by a Plague of Rust, which drops the Prince's armour. That gives me a little bit of an insurance there. If Claude doesn't manage to show a heroic killing blow, perhaps I can collapse the Demon Prince under static combat resolution. Elsewhere, my knight units, on the right of the battlefield and in the centre, charge off the dog chaff in front of them. I'm also able to deliver a decisive hammer charge to the Dragon Ogre block on the centre right. Repanse downs her potion of foolhardiness, which gives her temporary immunity to psychology. She's able to trace a line from the corner of her base just past that dog screen, and her and the Pegasus Knights crash into the mutated creatures. That looks like a pretty decisive charge there. I think I've a good chance of being able to rout these Dogers. Fleur has cautiously pushed herself forwards, and finally some shooting does a little bit of damage. With a wind blast from her, and also some arrows from the peasant bowman, we managed to fell the wounded Shartak that Claude Vollier was fighting earlier. For movement, I keep those Forsaken occupied by skirting the 5-man unit of squires by their corner in front of them. It's going to be very difficult for Joby to exert much pressure with this infantry block. In Old World, because infantry are so slow and have to pay for their wheeling out of charging, it's almost impossible for them to get charges on other things that aren't infantry. I think he's done realistically about as well as he could do. He's used Steed of Shadows to throw the Forsaken across the table, and then used dog screens to try and cramp up my knights who are clustered together. However, even with these favourable tailwinds, it's not going to make much difference, because I've got some chaff here as a second line of defence. Right, onto the combat phase. First we have the charge of Repanse and the Pegasus Knights. The Equestrian Flying Squadron inflicts 6 wounds on the Dogers. However, the remaining duo do bite back a bit and knock 2 wounds off Repanse. However, they're comfortably beaten. We break them and then run them down. In the centre of the board, in true Hero Hammer style, the 2 generals meet. Claude Vollier once again spoons his attacks and hits the Demon Prince only once. However, like Scaramanga with the golden gun, you only need 1 shot when you've got the virtue of heroism, and off comes the Demon Prince's head. Right, that was a pretty emphatic Bretonnian turn 2. I've taken off around 700 points of Joby's army. Moving on to his turn 3, the Chaos Sorcerer once again manages to summon the demonic vessel. I sense he's going to need it. Because he's got nowhere to hide from Claude Vollier's 360-degree vision arc, Joby, after some consideration, decides that he's going to charge him with his dragon. I neglected to say that in my last turn, both dog screens were destroyed by those charging knights. The Green Knight unit on the right, however, failed their restraint test and barreled up the table. This has given the Giant an outside charge of being able to connect, and the Knights won't be able to flee because they're too near the board edge. Joby needs to show a 5 on one of his dice for a charge that might help get him back in the game, but he can't do so. For his movement, there's not really much left. The Forsaken have got no charge targets because I've managed to get all my knights out of the way, and Joby doesn't want to charge the skirmishing screen in front of him. He also can't use the Steed of Shadows because he's committed his sorcerer to combat. There's really not much more for him in this game than to hope his dragon is somehow able to survive the virtue of heroism and knock down Claude Vollier in return. Right, onto the combat phase. The only thing going in the Chaos Sorcerer's favour is that he has got a couple of good Chaos rewards off the random mutation tables. I think he's got an extra strength, an extra attack, and he's got Demonic Vessel up. However, even with all these enhancements, the Chaos Sorcerer can't damage Claude Vollier. For its part, the dragon attacks and smashes 1 wound off the young noble. Claude Vollier then unfurls his golden lance, and with a single fluid motion, scores 2 6s and decapitates both mutated heads of the Chaos Dragon. The remainder of this game, or should I say funeral procession for the Chaos, can be very swiftly summarised. Needless to say, the Green Knight comes back to life, and storms out of the forest in a charge on the side of the Forsaken. Because the man in green is back, both Knight Wedges in front also charge in, including a unit of Pegasus Knights. Claude Vollier's energies aren't spent, and he also ploughs into the Forsaken to help out. We rip apart 14 of the Forsaken in the combat phase. The remaining rabble use their stubborn to fall back in good order, but they're not long for this world, and my Pegasus Knights and my normal Knights finish them off in the next turn. Claude Vollier, meanwhile, restrains and reforms, and flies into the middle of the table. In the remainder of this game, the zealous Duke hunts down all that's left of Joby's army, that single remaining giant in the flank. 1 flash of gold later, and the giant's head is rolling across the battlefield, knocking the remaining Forsaken over like a 10-pin bowling ball. We've tabled Joby's Chaos army in 4 turns, and Claude Vollier has personally slaughtered 1,300 points of the Warriors of Dark Gods on his own. If that's not Hero Hammer, punks, I don't know what is. Right, needless to say, this was a thumping 20-0 victory to the Bretonnians. I destroyed the entirety of Joby's army, and he destroyed nothing of mine. While this was a very decisive win, and from a competitive perspective I'm very pleased with it, I don't think it was a very great advertisement for Warhammer the Old World. Hopefully both of us will get some more varied and balanced games in our remaining 4 rounds. Right, on to game 2, and this time I'm playing Chris Hale with his Wood Elves. Chris is another veteran of Triple Crown events, and I played him 4 times before. In the last couple of years, since he discovered Wood Elves, Chris has undergone something of a metamorphosis. In the past, he was the nice guy who rocked up with the fluffiest and least optimised list imaginable, and generally lost. But recently, he's turned into someone who picks a rather harder, nastier, more deadly list, and while remaining nice, usually wins. So let's talk about Wood Elves in Warhammer the Old World. Of all of the core factions at any rate, I feel these are the force that have changed the least compared to 8th edition. They still dance, they still shoot, and they still don't fight, except for the ones that do. So he's got 2 units of Glade Guard and 2 units of Deepwood Scouts to provide the majority of his shooting. Worryingly for me, almost all his archers have got the Arcane Bodkin's arrows, which are -2 AP and are probably the best at taking off Bretonnians. He's got some Glade Riders and a level 4 wizard rocking magic missiles to add to the hail of arrows. The combat bit of his force is probably larger though than ones we would have seen in previous editions. He's got some trees, which is nice to see, in the shape of 4 treekin, who have a considerable buff over what they had in 8th edition, and 2 tree men. I'm not sure about either of these units. They look good on paper, but I think they're going to be struggling to charge with their movement of 5. And to round off the force, to no one's particular surprise, we have another son of Draco. So this Wood Elf Dragon is a reasonable one in the Draconic pecking order. Toughness 6, 4 up armor, 5 up ward, and 9 wounds. Perhaps his best characteristic, though, is his annoyance of netlings, which means he's going to be -1 to hit in a challenge. Now, despite my knowledge of the Wood Elf magic items being rather limited, I come to suspect that this noble might have a certain magic spear. This is of course the Spear of Twilight, which gives its rider Killing Blow. That's the dangerous one against me. Monster Slayer doesn't do anything, but Killing Blow will sever Claude Vollier's head and that of the Green Knight if Chris is the one that rolls the 6 this time. I think Chris also dials into the fact that my Duke has heroic Killing Blow too. If the two generals do meet, it's really going to be a game to see who can roll a 6 first. Now, even though neither of us state this, I think we both make the following calculation. I think this matchup is inherently rather a good one for the Bretonnians. Sure, Chris has got a lot of armor penetration arrows, but he's also got lots of small units and I've got loads of speed and the Green Knight. He's got nowhere near enough firepower to deal with 2 blocks of Pegasi and all of these fast-moving troops, and I think I'll be able to smash apart his units if I get into them. For that reason, I think Chris realises that he's behind the 8 ball with the matchup. When you're in a tough position, it makes sense to take risks, and I think Chris wants this fight between the two generals. From my perspective, I think there's plenty of points to be scored elsewhere, so I'd rather not take the chance. Spell-wise, Fleur rolls up Plague of Rust, Summon Elemental Spirit, Windblast and the Lady's Gift. Chris's Mage rolls up Fireball, Arcane Urgency, Oaken Shield and the Wood Elf signature spell Tree Singing, which allows him to place a wood on the board. Now, the deployment in this scenario is meeting engagement, which is the one that tends to lead to tape measures snapping across the table and models getting knocked out of the way, because it's diagonal to diagonal. You also literally start within spitting distance of each other if you like. This does rather favour me, I think, because it means my knights get a bit closer to Chris's archers. However, this is also the scenario where you have to roll for your units, and if you roll a 1, they come in as a reserve move. I fail with a single knight unit and Repanse. I also roll a 1 with Fleur, which means she's not going to be placed on the board either. That's going to make it quite difficult for her to get within 24 of the Elven Wizard and stop her rival's magic. Chris fails, however, with by far the most important unit on the board, the Dragon. That's quite important because it means that creature's not going to be able to charge in turn 1, which means I can deploy rather more aggressively. Now, with Bretonnians, usually you always pray, but against some armies where you really need to surge forward, and where you're not going to be getting the 5-up blessing anyway, sometimes I like to take the chance, and Wood Elves are one of those whom you can do that to. However, on this occasion I don't decide to do it, and Chris duly gets the first turn. The dragon waddles onto the board on one side to threaten the sides of those lances, and staying well away, for the time being at any rate, from the Duke. Most of Chris's army stays in his deployment zone, with the tree men just shuffling up a bit. In the shooting phase, Chris eliminates one of my units of squires and sends a second one packing with a panic test. A single knight from the green unit finds an arrow punched through his chainmail and he is thrown from his horse. The Wood Elf Mage, meanwhile, an advocate as you might imagine of rewilding, throws his hands in the air and a wood sprouts from the ground. This is placed in the path of my red and green knight units to slow them down. That wasn't too bad, but Bretonnian turn 1 gets off to a poor start as the Green Knight doesn't show. Now Chris has packed the wood in his deployment zone with some tree men and one of his archer units, meaning the Green Knight can't place there. But of course Chris has just gone and created another wood, and the Green Knight would have been able to materialise there and charge one of the tree men. As it is, he's left slumbering in the spirit realm. On the left-hand side of the battlefield, I throw Duke Claude Vollier and the Pegasus Knights forwards towards Chris's Treekin and his archers. Repanse and the waylaid Blue Knight unit come on and can only use their normal movement rate. The placement of this magical elven wood from Chris was really rather good, I think, because my red and my green knight units pretty much have no choice but to plough through it. There's an impassable stone tower on their left, and the evil draconic gaze of Chris's Gemma on the right. The knights plough through the wood, fortunately not failing any dangerous terrain tests, and sitting just out of charge range of that tree man. Finally, my third unit of squires, who I neglected to say also failed that test on the dawn attack roll, come on the table edge and move towards the forest. I think they're going to struggle to be relevant in this game, given how far away they are from the action. Now, while Fleur, my level 4 wizard, has come onto the table, she's only been able to move her regular movement rate, and she's miles away from her wood elf counterpart. That means that once again Chris is going to be getting off all his spells in the next turn. That was rather a damp squib of a turn, but unfortunately that tower, that wood in the middle of the table, the dragon on the right hand side, and failing that dawn attack roll with 4 of my units has rather compromised my offensive push. That being said, Claude Vollier, leading from the front again, is well on top of the Wood Elves, and so Chris is going to have some decisions to make in his next turn. So, on Wood Elf turn 2, Chris starts by replanting that wood in exactly the same place it was before. The tree man also moves up towards the 2 knight wedges. Now, this is one of the occasions where that triangular lance formation, cool though it does look, creates some rather perverse situations. If you can ram a single model up very close to 2 lances that are in quite close echelon with each other, you can have a very strange situation where both of them block each other. The Glade Lord on his Forest Dragon mount, meanwhile, takes to the sky and flies over that ruin and the 2 startled squires below him. He stations himself to the right-hand side of the Green Knight wedge. With the tree man in front, a dragon on one side, a wood on top of them, and a tower on the left, those knights are pretty hemmed in. Now, the Wood Elves need a good shooting phase here, because some of these Bretonnians are close to being on top of them, and they absolutely do get one. Taking advantage of the fact that Fleur is on the other side of the battlefield, the Elven Mage uses his Fireball and his Ruby Ring of Ruin to maximum effect, and he and the archers on the right-hand side manage to destroy the whole of the unit of Pegasus Knights that are right on top of them. A single rider did survive the shooting, but he panicked and ran off the board. That's annoying, because those Pegasus Knights were literally on top of much of Chris's army and could have made a very decisive charge even if I'd perhaps only held on to a single rider. The Wood Elves' remaining shooting, though, in the centre and on the left, failed to do any significant damage to the Bretonnians, with just a single wound taken from one of the Pegasus Knights on the left-hand side. On Bretonnian turn 2, it's time for some charges. The first is to charge those archers who are in front of the Treekin with my Pegasus Knights. The skirmishing elves elect to fire and flee, knowing that they'll bounce through the Treekin and be able to stand on the board edge. However, Chris rolls only a 3 with his distance and pops just behind the Treekin. The Bretonnians get quite lucky with their charges, and the Pegasus Knights successfully redirect into the wooden men, and Claude Vollier also manages to get a hefty charge into the wood to skewer more of them with his mighty golden lance. I think I'm going to sweep away Chris on the left-hand side, but in the centre and on the right, things are looking a bit less good for the Bretonnians. They're looking particularly bad because that Green Knight, who once again could have burst out from that temporary elven magical wood, once again fails to roll the 3+ he needs to show, and so again has to continue to languish in the spirit realm. While Fleur is now on the table, she's miles away from the elven wizard, and Chris has moved his own spellcaster to the right, so even if Fleur marches up, she's still going to be outside of dispel range. It seems as though the Bretonnians spent turns 5 and 6 of the last round celebrating their victory inside 4 turns, with heavy drinking in the banqueting hall. The Green Knight's still sleeping like a baby, Repanse is late, and Fleur has gone and turned up on the wrong side of the battlefield in turn 2, being unable to influence anything with her short-range magical spells. Once again, it's the young Duke who's showing his seniors how it's done. He's stone cold sober, and he's already mixing it with the opposition in their deployment zone. For my remaining moves, the blue unit and Repanse move up as fast as they can, hoping to be of relevance in the proceedings. The Green Knight unit is more or less completely blocked by a club sandwich of dragon, treeman, forest and tower. The Red Knight unit, however, manages to be a bit cute with its manoeuvring and manages to sweep around in an angled motion around the tree man in order to threaten some of the elves on the board edge. Right, into the combat phase. The Pegasus Knights bring down a treekin between them, but then it's time for the young Duke to attack. Old World sea levels rise by 3 inches as the Duke indulges in an orgy of deforestation. 2 of the treekin are felled. The remaining plant fails his leadership test and runs off the board. The Pegasus Knights spur after them, not intent on them, but in catching the archers who ran behind them. This is successful, and they too are destroyed. Right, it's Wood Elf turn 3, and Chris has got most of his army still left on the right-hand side of the board, with a sea of targets in front of him. For its part, the Glade Lord on the Dragon charges the Red Knight unit in the side. I think about fleeing, but I'm worried about bouncing through all my own units. In any case, I do have a champion in this knight unit, and so there's every chance I'll be able to hold the beast up. At this moment, I don't think the battle is going that well for me, despite my victory over there against the Treequin, and so Claude Vollier is perhaps re-evaluating his policy of non-engagement. Elsewhere, the Wood Elf shooting squishes the 2 archers who were running away across that elven ruin. They also manage to panic the Green Knight unit, bringing 2 more of them down. They flee into the wood, and the tree man moves after them. In the centre of the board, the Glade Lord unfurls his Spear of Twilight. The brave Red Knight unit champion is beheaded, and the dragon wins combat by 1. Unfortunately for me, the Red Knight unit break. The dragon contemplates on whether to pursue or not, but in the end Chris decides not to do so. I think he prefers being where he is. He's in the centre of the table, and he's pushing all my knights and my Pegasi back. If he were to career forwards, my Blue Knight unit certainly would be able to run out of his arc, and the Pegasus Knights as well. Anchored where he is, the dragon is more easily able to push my own main threats back to the left-hand side of the table. Often when you're playing with Wood Elves, the main point of these fast, powerful units is less to actually do fighting, but to try and push your opponent back to give your archers the time they need to shoot. Now, from Bretonnian turn 3 onwards, things got very intense, and I don't have many pictures of the game, so I'm going to have to just describe. So, for the 3rd turn in a row, the Green Knight didn't show. Once again, this is a real kick down there for the Bretonnians. This time, of course, he could have placed on the wood vacated by the Treekin and been able to exert influence at the top. The Green Knights continue to flee through the wood and off the board, giving Chris another block of victory points. There's better news on my left flank, however, as that Red Knight unit manages to rally. Meanwhile, my Pegasus Knights on the left-hand side take the easy points on offer by disposing of that 5-man skirmishing archer block on the left-hand side near the table edge. Fleur literally hasn't said boo to a goose throughout this battle, but she does manage to get a Plague of Rust on the tree man, which is advancing near the tower. This enables one of the peasant bowmen to pierce its bark with a low-budget arrow and it loses a wound. The rallied Red Knights and the young Duke Claude Vollier, meanwhile, fly out of the dragon's arc of sight to try and threaten the remaining Wood Elves and that tree man nearer to Chris's right-hand side. In Chris's next turn, the dragon tries long bomb charges on both the blue unit of knights and the Pegasus Knights. Both of them elect to flee, not using their swift stride, to get them just out of the creature's range. This is a failed charge, and the winged serpent lumbers forwards. Incidentally, now on hindsight, I think we got this rule wrong. Of course, we're used to 8th edition, and a failed charge just means you go the highest of your dice on your charge roll. In Old World, if you're charging a unit which fled, rather than actually failing to get your charge distance, you move your full movement rate, which would have actually meant the dragon would have been right up on top of my 2 units on the left-hand board edge. A bit of rustiness there from us both, but I'm not sure it affected the game too much. Both knight units actually rally in my next turn, and because you can move after rallying in Old World, they would have easily been able to get out of the creature's arc, assuming it had moved its full distance. To be honest, the rest of this game was something of a Mexican standoff. The elves shot a few things here and there. They managed to finish off that 5-man squire unit. There weren't really any other viable targets though. Repanse and Fleur both hid behind the tower. My Duke was really too tough for his shooting to take down, and the Red Knight unit, through placing itself in some cute positions, managed to survive the remaining arrow fire. The only event of note that did occur is the Green Knight finally emerged. Chris was of course well aware of this possibility, and had left his wizard and his glade riders well outside of the charge range that the Green Knight could potentially influence. When the champion of Bretonnia does emerge from the green, he's got that tree man standing in front of him, and he goes and charges it. He duels it for 2 turns, but they're both very disappointing, and he can only wound the creature once. In my final turn, I have the option of whether to charge Claude Vollier into the tree man or the archer unit in front of him. I actually opt for the latter of those two options, which was definitely a mistake. Because they're skirmishers, I thought I could easily see them off the board, but of course I forget that they've got a champion. The zealous chopping machine's energies are rather wasted, and all he does is make them fall back in good order, which isn't good enough to score me any points. That was too cautious from me there. I was afraid of the treeman's tree whack, but I think Claude Vollier had only lost one or possibly no wounds by this point, so that was rather craven given how well I'd been rolling with him thus far. And so this battle drew to a close. My knights and my Pegasus knights on my board edge cowered behind the hill from the dragon. Repanse and Fleur hid behind the tower, and the elves on the right-hand board also skirted towards the table edge. The tree men stood in the centre, either being too tough for the Bretonnians to wound, or too frightening for them to fight. When we totted up the points, it ended up as a 10-10 draw. Chris was only 8 victory points away from securing an 11-9, however, so the Bretonnians only just hung on to that by the skin of their teeth. Now, this was of course a very different game from my game 1. I certainly didn't have things all my own way. The fact that my characters were waylaid, especially Fleur and Repanse, and the Green Knight didn't turn up until the 5th turn severely compromised my attempts to exert pressure on the Wood Elves. I certainly blundered though, I think, by being too cautious with Claude Vollier. For certain, I should have charged that tree man on my last turn, and he was worth 200 points on his own. As to whether I should have charged that dragon or not, well, it would have been heads or tails. Either I'd have shown a 6 or Chris would have shown a 6, and that would have pretty much decided the game. In a strictly competitive sense, if you're going to outscore 50 other players at a large tournament, you're probably going to have to take those kind of risks. But you know man, it just seems so brainless to reduce this game to who can roll a 6 first. It's not even snakes and ladders, it's just snake. And the snake flies. Anyway, this was much better than my first game, and felt much more like a classic Wood Elves and Bretonnian matchup. Perhaps the fact that the two generals didn't come to blows was probably for the best. I think the game probably was a lot more interesting with neither player getting to carry away the head of his opponent, rather than just one or the other. Right, on to round 3, and I hope you like desert punks, because I'm on exactly the same table I was before. This scenario is Battle for the Pass, which means fighting lengthways across the table rather than widthways. I'm not really a fan of this. As well as having to lean across the table to move your troops on the outer extremity, it tends to bottle both sides in, which rather limits the potential for funky movement. Anyway, my third opponent is Ryan Kemp, and he's using a force of lizard men. I've not played Ryan before, but immediately he seems like a very nice guy. He says he's played a bit of 8th edition, but most of his experience was from 6th and 7th. Now for dyed-in-the-wool 8th Ed veterans like me, and those who have dabbled in the 9th Age, it's going to be an interesting experience getting used to facing these kind of players. Now Ryan is by no means the most extreme example of this here, because he has played quite a bit of 8th edition, but some of the other players at this event, including some who were fighting on very high tables, had played very little 8th Ed, or maybe they quit when it was quite new. Now, I don't actually get to fight one of these sorts of players in the remainder of my tournament, which is a pity because they often have a very different set of perspectives about Old World, what they think of the game, but also just generally how they play. That'll have to wait till some other time, punks, because properly exploring that little side alley with all its nooks and crannies would take a whole other video. So, let's take a little look at Ryan's splendidly painted Lizardman force. Now, Lizardmen historically are what you would call a combined arms sort of army. They can more or less do everything, but are only outstanding in a couple of relatively niche categories. They are also the first of the PDF legacy armies that I've faced in a tournament. I did my homework on these before I got here, and I have to say, looking at the Lizardman Arcane Journal, it looks like a pile of absolute garbage. There's not a lot in it that looks particularly threatening as far as I can tell. The Stegodons look okay, the Skinks look okay, although worse than before, and there are a few little niche things like Razodons, which look as though they might have some kind of use. Their problem seems to be very simply that they've not got much that flies in their army. Most of the Lizardmen monsters, good as they are landlocked. That means that they can be chaffed, and some of them, like the Stegodon, don't even have swift stride, and so they're going to be outranged by the other very many numerous fast, powerful things that do. And then of course for Lizardmen armies that rely on infantry, Saurus, Temple Guard and Croxagore. They face the sad reality that Old World will in posterity, I'm sure, be known as the edition where infantry players go to die. To be fair, the Lizardmen infantry, with the partial exception of the Temple Guard, weren't that great in 8th edition either, but that wasn't because infantry were bad in that edition, it was just because they weren't very good. Now, one thing that was good in 8th edition, and seems at least passable in this, although I'm a little bit unconvinced about it, are the skinks. Ryan's got plenty of these, and these of course have a mixture of javelins and blowpipes. He's also got some chameleon skinks as well. Now of course, traditionally, and very much so in Old World, Bretonnians are not a great army for these skinks to face. Why? Because we've got lots of high generic armour saves. Now of course, it is much better to be facing an army that's based on generic 3+ armour saves, as Bretonnians now are in Old World, rather than 2+ as they were in the past, but nonetheless, it's not ideal. So, aside from this infantry, which I think is going to have a very hard time of it from Ryan's perspective, he's got a few other things in the list. The first is a Scarvet on a Carnosaur. This guy does have Swift Stride, and the Carnosaur does D3 wounds on monstrous targets. But of course, I don't have any monstrous targets. My main heroes go around killing monsters, not being killed by them. Nonetheless, the Scarvet himself could have a particularly nasty magic sword and could threaten my heroes in many different ways. But I can tell you that Claude Vollier was already sharpening his lance when Ryan unpacked this Carnosaur from his tray. Aside from that, he's got one Stegodon, and you still very much don't want to be charged by one of these. Then there's the Slan. Now the Slan works in a very different way to what he did in previous editions. Generally Slans sat inside units, particularly Temple Guard of course, but now they can't actually join those units because they're on a weird and different incompatible base size. What happens is that they sort of float around in the action. They can fly by dint of their floating platform, but they actually move around the table quite a lot now, rather than sitting static in a unit. Also reading their rules, I can't understand why they cost as many points as they do. Sure, they're still a powerful level 4 wizard, but man, I think I can get something that's nearly as good as that for about half the cost. So putting all of this together about, I think, the generic weakness of Lizardmen, and of course I think the very strong compatibility that I have once again in the matchup, facing down an infantry list with an army full of cavalry and heroes, I think I've got an excellent chance of winning this game very decisively if I play my cards right. So, looking at my deployment, I placed my red and blue knight units in sort of echelon formation to sweep around the sides of the tower, where I placed my vanguarding squires behind. Claude Vollier and Repanse I sit near the centre, but closer to the Carnosaur and the Slan. I also think that perhaps if I send 2 knight units and the Pegasus Knights potentially at those Temple Guard, with some hero support I might be able to break them. Ryan has got a block of Saurus there and the Stegodon, and they're mainly going to be facing a unit of Pegasus Knights, and if I want to, the Red Knight unit, assuming I send them round that side of the tower. I think that probably my best chance is going to be to try and sweep everything off the lower section of the table and leave the stuff on the top, or try to deal with it later. I think the main danger for me is if one of these infantry blocks overperforms my very meagre expectation and manages to absorb my charge. Certainly I don't want to get hit by the Croxagore, the Stegodon or that Carnosaur. I think those are where the principal threats are going to be. The Slan I'm much less worried about. He's running elementalism like me, and while some of those spells are quite good, including of course Plague of Rust against Bretonnians, there's no missile spell I'm really that afraid of, or that I think will significantly be able to compromise my heroes. All that being said, I've underestimated Lizardmen many times before in previous editions. In the hands of a skillful player, they can be very dangerous. The game gets off to an unexpected start, which is that I get the first turn. This is because after I pray, Ryan decides to give this to me. While contrary to conventional thinking, this is actually a perfectly reasonable decision, I think. Ryan doesn't have any long-range shooting of his own, and neither do I. So perhaps it's better to just see what I do, and then take the last turn at the end. I didn't mention Fleur's spells. I believe she's got the 2 favourites, Plague of Rust and Windblast, and then the Lady's Gift. She's also got the entirely redundant Summon Elemental Spirit. I regard this spell a little bit to be like a taunt in a fighting game, something you do purely for artistic reasons which has no bearing upon the actual outcome. So the Bretonnians push forwards, and I decide to divert the majority of my army to the bottom of the board where most of the characters are in Ryan's army. Personally, I love to see an impassable piece of terrain in the centre of a battlefield, because it means that I can use my speed to try and cut an opponent's army in half. Hopefully what he's got in the area where my army isn't won't be able to affect matters very much, and will spend most of the game stumbling around. I march up Claude Vollier outside the arc of the Carnosaur, where he's going to be able to cause no end of trouble later. that Slan is pretty much going to have to cower behind the flank of the Temple Guard to be spared from a charge from the young Duke. The Pegasi, meanwhile, I'm a lot more aggressive with. They jump forwards, but one of the Pegasi gets its hoof entangled in the trees and drops a wound from dangerous terrain. I know I'm in charge range of that Carnosaur, but I'm absolutely fine with that. I'll just flee. The Carnosaur will then stumble forward, and I'll be in an excellent position to destroy it with Claude Vollier. My Pegasus Knights on the top of the table, though, do only inch forwards a bit more cautiously. My thinking there is to try to take that Stegodon out of the game. If Ryan commits the Stegodon to fighting the rest of my army, it's going to take a long time for it to get there, and I think I'll probably be able to take that Saurus block, especially with the help of my Green Knight with those Pegasus Knights. I probably won't be able to do that if he gangs up on me with both units, but at least they'll be taken out of the game if he does. I also roll for my Green Knight, and this time he appears in a phosphorus cloud of smoke from the hill at the edge of the battlefield. Now Ryan has actually been considering the possibility the Green Knight would do this, bursting forth from this hill, which did of course count as a natural piece of terrain on this battlefield because we only had one forest. Ryan actually put his screen of chameleon skinks there to stop the Green Knight charging the back of his Stegodon. As it is, the champion of Bretonnia is content to charge that skink screen in front of him. I'm going to be able to do plenty more damage after I've disposed of them. In the combat phase, the Green Knight actually fights astonishingly badly. He rolls only a 1 for the extra attacks from his Dolorous Blade, and can dispose of only a single pathetic skink. The remainder do lose combat by 1, but they manage to stick and only give ground. Right, on to Ryan's turn 1, and I think he's going to need to show a few tricks here if he's going to get out of the thumbscrew that the Bretonnians have placed him in. The first decision he makes is to commit the Stegodon to those Pegasus Knights. Now that Saurus block and the dinosaur are both facing them. That's fine by me, I've got to say. I'll just fly over the top of them and threaten his back. The rest of Ryan's movement, though, I really like. He uses his skirmishing skinks to get in all sorts of awkward positions. He manages to have it so that Claude Vollier can't place against his Carnosaur. He also is alive to the threat coming from the Green Knight when he probably destroys the skinks in the next turn and floats the lizard over to the back of the Temple Guard. There's a bit of shooting here and there from the lizardmen with their blowpipes. They're able to panic one of the squire units in the forest and send them running towards my board edge. 3 others from the unit by the tower also fall, poisoned darts embedded in their necks. In the combat phase, the Green Knight gets his act together and slaughters all of the remaining skinks with his Dolorous Blade. The makers of Warhammer the Old World absolutely loved the overrun rule and loved troops overrunning all over the place at all times. I take advantage of it on this occasion, and the Green Knight surges forwards towards the flank of the Croxagore and the rear of the Stegodon. The fact that he's got a 360-degree charge arc really does allow me to have my cake and eat it. Generally when you overran or pursued in 8th edition, you were confined then only to charging things in your front arcs. You might have to sacrifice opportunities elsewhere. Here there's no disadvantage to doing both, so I think I'll have another slice of jam roly-poly please, Vicar. Right, so on to Bretonnian turn 2. Ryan didn't take the bait and charge the Pegasus Knights with the Carnosaur. He decided to defensively reinforce it behind those skink screens. Now, however, I've got a great chance to land some potentially decisive charges. My 3 knight triangles are all a bit too far away, but they can at least advance up. However, my Pegasi can absolutely get into the action. Before they do so, Fleur throws out 2 spells on the Croxagore, who are my principal target. The first is a Plague of Rust. The second is the Lady's Gift, which should help out my Pegasus Knights. Repanse and the Pegasus Knights both manage to make it into the Croxagore, with the latter being able to trace a line through the edge of the tower. My Green Knight unit was also able to declare a charge on the skinks in front of the Carnosaur, and surprisingly Ryan decides to flee. The Duke readies his Golden Lance, locking it in on a radar lock to the Carnosaur's heart. These elite Bretonnians are joined by another, the Green Knight in the side of the Croxagore unit. Surely that unit's going to be toast now. For my remaining movement, the 2 routed squires continue to flee. They also pass through one of the other squire unit, which also panics them and they fall back in good order. The red and the blue units, meanwhile, advance to cover the advancing green unit which chased off those skinks. Those 3 lances are parked together in a rather aesthetically pleasing formation, I think, and hopefully one that should be quite effective too come the next turn. On the north of the battlefield, the Pegasus Knights in front of that Stegodon and that Saurus block hop over them. I'm more than happy with that, there's plenty of points down here on the south. The shooting phase sees a rather peripheral firefight involving the peasant bowmen and some squires who are trying to shoot some skinks. They do a bit of damage here and there, as the skinks do to them, but it all feels rather irrelevant compared to the main battles here in the centre. Right, so first we go to the mighty triple combo charge of the Pegasus Knight, Repanse and the Green Knight, augmented by 2 of Fleur's spells. Suffice to say, that's much too much for these poor old Croxagore, and they're banished back to a spawning lake in some irrelevant province in Lustria, without a single one of them remaining alive. I don't get it all my own way though, because of my troops that all try to restrain from having to make one of those obligatory old world overruns TM, only the Green Knight passes, and Repanse and the Pegasus Knights career forwards into no man's land and provincial irrelevance. Right, turning to the other combat, and it's heroic killing blow time, folks. Or is it? This time, Claude Vollier's attacks connect largely with thin air. He does only 1 wound with his lance and can't show a heroic killing blow. Fortunately, the Carnosaur and its Scarvet Rider do nothing to him in return, meaning the combat's a draw. However, Claude's right in front of that Temple Guard block now, and they're going to be charging into him. Surely now it's finally at last a chance for infantry to shine. Ryan can challenge with his Temple Guard unit champion, thus taking the Carnosaur out of danger for the time being. Apart from this offence, all Ryan can really do is reposition his Stegodon and his Saurus to try and be influential later. The skinks to the south of the Knight units crowd round and once again rattle off with their poisoned blowpipes and javelins. They do a little bit of damage, but Ryan isn't being lucky with his poison rolls. There seems to be an extra modifier at play here with these skinks compared to what there was in 8th edition. They don't seem to really be pumping out the number of wounds I'd expect. I haven't checked the rules though, perhaps Ryan's just been unlucky. The Slan, meanwhile, is still motivated primarily by defensive considerations and hovers behind the Carnosaur. Ryan is also not being lucky with his magic spells and isn't managing to get any of them off, being stopped by Fleur, who is having by far her best game so far. The combat phase sees the real chance for the Lizardmen to get back in this game. As expected, the Temple Guard unit champion steps forward, and Magic Claude has rather lost his touch as he fails to damage it. For almost the first time in the tournament, his Royal Pegasus wakes up because it actually has something to fight. It also fails to connect with the Saurus champion. For its part, the doughty lizard managed to swing its halberd into the Duke and wound him. The Duke is well beaten, having lost combat by 6. He's also going to be fleeing towards the board edge, because centre to centre of the lizard unit would send him that way. Unfortunately for Ryan though, the Duke does also of course have a backup insurance policy, and that's the stubborn rule which is conferred to him by dint of his Grail vow. He falls back in good order, bouncing over the skink skirmish screen to be able to place quite comfortably on the remainder of the table. Ryan can't pursue him because he can't place any of his troops because my Duke has bounced through his. This is one of these perverse instances which are very common in Old World, where falling back in good order is actually much better than giving ground. In this case, because I could bounce over Ryan's troops and thus stop him pursuing me. Another one, of course, is the ability to reform into any formation. Lines, whereas your pursuing opponent doesn't get that option. Anyway, I think Ryan is very unlucky here. He had an optimal combat situation and managed to use an infantry block in precisely the way it was intended, but he's only made me fall back in good order because of the placement of those skinks. Astute viewers may realise, with the benefit of hindsight, and this isn't something that I realised at the time either, that Ryan could have escorted the Duke off the board and prevented him from getting a place to land by moving his southern skink block up to the right slightly. Anyway, moving on to Bretonnian turn 3, and unfortunately there's no second prize for that near miss from Ryan. Now his infantry block is stranded in front of all 3 of my knight units, as well as all those Pegasus Knights and Repanse who are free now from the back. In taking that charge with his Temple Guard, he's also opened up his slan to the Pegasus Knights who are back behind his lines. The Temple Guard are hit in the front and the flank by 5 combo charging units. Well, actually only 4. We decided that the Red Knight unit couldn't quite fit. Before he was charged, the Slan did have a bit better of a time dispelling things and managed to stop both the Lady's Gift and Plague of Rust on the Temple Guard. On the north of the battlefield, I decide that Stegodon has already been pulled far enough out of position, and in any case, this battle is already careering towards a swift conclusion in the south, so I don't think it's going to get there in time. For that reason, I decide to use those Pegasus Knights that just flew over the Saurus to charge back into their rear, exploiting their 360-degree vision arc. For his part, Claude Vollier isn't able to place against the Carnosaur, but flies up behind the Temple Guard to be able to attack it next turn potentially. With beating drums, we come up to the Bretonnian combat phase, and I have a feeling it's not going to be a nice one for the lizards. The Knights, Repanse and the Green Knight roll like fire and rend apart 15 of the Temple Guards. Because step-up's been confined to the dustbin of history, these poor lizards aren't even allowed to swing, and so Ryan is just simply pasted. We more than double outnumber him, and they break. They flee away from the central Blue Knight unit, which is the largest, and that means Repanse is much closer to them. Despite the lizards rolling a double 6 on their flea roll, she's easily able to catch them and cut them down. That's the end of the Temple Guard and the end of Ryan's infantry. While it may have seen the elimination of the Temple Guard many millennia ago, the Slann is still surprised by these Pegasus Knights impudently appearing in its flank. It challenges, and the Pegasus Knights refuse and thus lose their blessing. The Winged Riders don't fight well, and the Slann actually manage to ping off a wound from one of them in reply. In the end, we only make it give ground. In the north of the battlefield, the secondary Pegasus Knight squadron attacks the Saurus warriors in the back. They fight well and drop 4 Saurus. The Saurus fall back in good order in reply, which is absolutely the best result that Ryan could have hoped for, because this of course enables them to spin round and adopt a more advantageous formation. However, if I'm in for a penny, I'm in for a pound, and the Pegasus Knights elect to pursue. Although that combat I think might grind on a little bit, if we can make them fall back in good order again, we might be able to push them off the side of the board. Right, that concludes a very eventful Bretonnian turn 3, where we'd swept aside many of these lizard men. The Slann's in big trouble on the side of the table edge and is almost certainly going to be destroyed. I also think we've got that last Saurus block more or less where we want them. The Stegodon isn't facing anything apart from a few peasant bowmen, and that Carnosaur is also looking the wrong way. I don't think there's any way back for Ryan now, but we'll see what he can do in his turn 3. So, the Carnosaur charges what he can see, which is the Green Knight unit in front of them. The Stegodon, meanwhile, is gun-shy of facing round to help the Saurus who are being attacked by the Pegasi, because he can see the Green Knight coming up by the side of the tower, and he knows that that's going to lock him. Ryan does get something small back, because those skinks with Javelin on the board edge all fire at Claude Vollier. They do a lot better and manage to make the Duke drop a wound, despite the fact that he's saving on 2s rerolling 1s. For their own part, the Saurus fight a lot better this time, because they're actually able to swing. This time they beat the Pegasus Knights by 1 and make the Riders give ground. There's nothing meanwhile the Slann can do. He can't use his magic because he's locked in combat with the Pegasus Riders. The Pegasi and their mounts facing the Slann manage to make him drop to just a single wound. He gives ground, pushing him to just a fraction of an inch of the table edge. This is literally the last few drops of juice on an emergency power generator for a life support machine, and in my mech's turn, the Slann is pushed off the board. The Carnosaur's charge on the Green Knights brings with it Ryan's first taste of any success in this game. I decided to hold with this unit because I thought that I could challenge the Carnosaur out with my unit champion and then let him have it with Claude Vollier in the rear with his Golden Lance in the next turn. However, the Knights fail their unmodified leadership test and break. The Knights don't flee very far, which is something of a mixed blessing. While they're all cut down by the Carnosaur, the creature isn't able to get far enough away from the imminent threat coming from its back. That threat materialises in Bretonnian turn 4, and both my Duke and Repanse charge it in the rear. The rest of my Knights hoover up one of the skink units, and Fleur pushes the other off the board with a wind blast. The Carnosaur declares a challenge in the combat phase, and why wouldn't he? Once again, Claude Vollier's energies seem to be spent, and he's not able to heroically killing blow the lizard. In response, the Carnosaur bites chunks out of the great young man and makes him drop a wound. It's only the fact that we're in the rear and we've got Repanse in there with her battle standard that enables us to win combat by 1, but the Carnosaur falls back in good order and turns round. We fight this combat again for 2 rounds, and once again the Duke's off colour and can't behead the scabby beast. The Scarvet Rider this time also takes a wound from the Duke, dropping him down to just 1. In the final round though, the Duke does well enough just to take a single wound off the beast, and that, combined with Repanse's BSB, is enough to make it lose combat by 1. The Carnosaur's been fortunate so far to survive for as long as it has. It is after all actually only a relatively inexpensive monster, but this time the leadership test comes out high and it breaks and flees. Repanse pursues it and destroys it. All that's left of Ryan's army is that Stegodon, which wanders away from the battle, intent on a dimensional realm gate that will take it back to its euphoric happiness in the Triassic era. Apart from that, there's just that smattering of Saurus, who fight inconclusively against the Pegasus Knights numerous times. The Saurus do start getting on top of the Pegasus Knights and actually beat them in combat twice. There's just one Pegasus Knight left by the last turn of the game, and he's made to fall back in good order, but unfortunately Ryan doesn't get any points for him. Right, so with that comes the end of the game. It was a pretty storming victory for the Bretonnians. I didn't completely table Ryan in the way I did Joby in round 1. There was some Saurus and that Stegodon left there still alive. Ryan didn't score very many points off me, just a single unit of Squires and that green unit of Knights of the Realm there at the end that were defeated by the Carnosaur. This was still enough for a 19-1 victory, however. Overall, my first day ended up as 49 points out of 60, with 120-0, 119-1 and 110-10. That's obviously an excellent opening day in any tournament, and it's probably going to put me on table 2 or table 3 come tomorrow morning. The Triple Crown organisers are coy about letting people know who they're going to be facing in the next round, and I'm unable to find out who my opponent will be tomorrow morning. There are a couple of Tomb King players who I hear are flying quite high, and I absolutely don't want to hit one of them because I can't play that kind of grindhammer. That's all for tomorrow morning though, and I join several other players in a little trip to some of the culinary delights of Southend. When one is in Rome, one should do as Romans do, and this amounted to a beefeater by the side of the motorway. I must admit I don't really understand the economy, or indeed the way of life of this part of Essex. It seems to consist primarily of driving cars along motorways and over flyovers and into shopping precincts, going to sunbed showrooms and retiling your bathroom. Pointing beamingly at the sunshine, the lady at the front desk of the Holiday Inn I was staying at was delighted to find I was here in town for leisure rather than work. I then told her I was going to be spending my entire weekend indoors playing with model soldiers, and that was the end of the conversation. A very good morning and welcome to day 2, and it's on to my round 4. So it seems as though my prayers have been answered and I haven't been landed with an immovable mortuary cult Tomb King list. Instead, I'm facing Warriors of Chaos. My opponent is Stephen Toll, who also, like Joby in the first round, has won a previous Triple Crown Grand Tournament in the Age of 8th edition. Unlike Joby, however, I discover that Steve has played plenty of Warhammer the Old World and has ratcheted up even more games than me. Looking at his list though, I have to say I think similar things to what I thought in the Joby game. If anything, this list is even more elite, and shiver me timbers, there's another dragon. Right, this lizard is pulling no punches. He's by far the nastiest one I've seen so far. The Chaos Dragonlord is one of the best variants, the reason being because it can have a ward save and regen. It also has 10 wounds instead of 9, and its rider can take an item which gives it magic resistance. As I discover later, this dragon has also been to the Essex Sunbed showroom to get another little tweakment, that being the enchanted aura which makes opponents with it strike last against it. This is going to give it a whole bunch of attacks, the rider and its dragon, before its opponent can even swing, and also give it the edge if the combat lasts a second round. Now of course I don't know the Dragonlord's magic items, but I do know that Chaos Warriors don't generically have a magic sword which confers Killing Blow. The only thing that does that is the Headman's Axe, which is otherwise rather suboptimal. I therefore tell the young Duke in no uncertain terms that he's got to get his Golden Lance back out after that derisory showing in the last game against that Carnosaur. Apart from the Hero Hammer component, which I have a feeling is yet again going to decide this game, we should also talk about the rest of Steve's army. Well, he's got quite a few picket lines of Khorne Forsaken. Now, these are the formations that I very much favour when I'm running Warriors of Chaos, and I think that they could be quite effective. Now, of course, Forsaken randomly mutate in each combat round, and if they show a 5 or a 6, they get Killing Blow, which is obviously perfect against my knights. There's also another option where they can get AP2, which is also excellent at punching through my armour. Aside from that, we've got some Chaos Knights. On the left-hand side, there are the absolutely useless Core Knights, who I think are one of the worst units in the game and absolutely embarrassing for their points. They do have Mark of Khorne, and so they will hit hard on the charge, but I think I'm going to be able to get the charge on them. On the right-hand side, however, we've got 6 Chosen Knights, and these heavy cavalry are nothing to be sniffed at. They have full plate armour for a 2+ armour save, 2 attacks each, and countercharge. Steve has a level 4 wizard on a horse, and in addition to the Ruby Ring of Ruin, which gives him a fireball, he's got Phantasmagoria, Word of Pain, and Battle Lust. Both of these excellent dark magic enhancements will make the Chaos Army, especially perhaps I think the Chosen Knights, deadly on the charge. He's also got some dogs and 3 Dragon Ogre Shartax. To be honest with you, I think this is the 4th really good matchup for my Bretonnians in 4 games. It's another super elite force. There's a dragon, and I've got the dragon-killing character. Sure, the Forsaken could be dangerous, especially if they get the right kind of mutations, but I think I'll be able to swing first against them and charge. Hopefully I should be able to kill significant numbers of them, and they won't be able to damage me much in reply. All this being said, if the young Duke stuffs up and the dragon kills him instead, I'm going to have my pants down and be fighting a thermonuclear war with pop guns. In this round, there is also something present that I really wish there was more of in this tournament. That is a mission. See that tower there in the middle? Unlike other buildings in Old World, it's possible to enter this particular tower if you're infantry. If you hold it at the end of the game, you get a bonus of 300 victory points. While that bonus is nice and absolutely worth going for, it's hardly going to alter the dimensions of the game though that much. Of course, given that I've got a cavalry army, I can't actually occupy this tower with very much. Also, the rules for this tower say that it can't actually be attacked by cavalry. That is, of course, unless they've got the fly rule. Anyway, to some extent this mission does actually dictate my deployment. It makes a lot of sense to put the peasant bowmen down in the centre and also my single vanguarding unit of squires up behind the tower. Hopefully later in the game, when I've cleared out the tower, one of these foot-based units will be able to walk into it and secure me that objective. Aside from that, I go for a pretty balanced and conventional deployment. I've got my Duke and Repanse in the centre, 3 of my knight triangles all there, and both of my Pegasus knights supporting on the side. Both of my scouting units, meanwhile, also pitch up in the middle of the battlefield to try and get in the way. Steve seems to have done pretty similar. He's got all his Forsaken infantry lines in the middle of the battlefield, and his 2 knight units off on the flank. 2 of the Dragon Ogre Shartax, the Chaos Lord and the Wizard, however, are on his right-hand side. This is where most of the points and most of the power are in the Chaos Army. For the first time, Fleur gets a bit of a bum roll on her elementalism spells, and while she gets Windblast, I don't secure Plague of Rust, which would definitely have been useful. Other than that, I get the Lady's Gift, Travel Mystical Pathway, and the ever-useless Summon Elemental Spirit. So, as per the standard convention, I pray, and we go into Steve's turn 1. Now, I've never fought Steve before, but I know him by reputation to be a very aggressive player. That's something you generally need to be if you're going to get big wins in 2.5 hour rounds. So, the opening Chaos turn is a very threatening one. The Forsaken behind the tower move into it and fortify it. They're going to spend the whole game there unless I can chase them out of it. As expected, the Chaos Dragon pushes up aggressively. It also gets a rather advantageous mutation from the random Chaos prayer table, this being +1 weapon skill. Not generally something to write home about if you're already weapon skill 7 anyway, but when you're about to go into an almost inevitable duel of death with another guy who's got weapon skill 7, suddenly you begin to hit on 3s, so it becomes very useful. I can't remember, and I'm not able to eyeball from this picture, whether Steve left me a potential charge with my Duke. If he did, it's a long one though. The rest of his army also push forwards as fast as it can. The Chosen Knights and also the Chaos Sorcerer moving up behind the dragon with the 2 Shartax to its right. Steve also moves up his core Chaos Knights towards the Pegasus Knights. By my way of reading things, that might be over-aggressive. I think my Knights will be able to charge that unit off because they've got no counter-charge. There's also a nice little piece of placement here from the Chosen Knights relative to the dragon. So obviously the Pegasus Knights can charge them, but they won't be able to place to get all of their riders in base-to-base contact because the dragon is in the way. Now, for troops in the Linehammer metaverse, that of course doesn't matter, but these Pegasus Knights have got 2 attacks each on the charge and 2 from the peg. I don't want them being out of base-to-base contact, that's going to significantly weaken them. The final thing Steve does is move his chaff screen of dogs forwards to cover both knight wedges. The main point of this isn't really to stop me charging, because I doubt Steve's too scared of my core knights. It's more that it's going to cramp up these units and give Steve something to charge even if I play evasively. There's no shooting or any magic of any consequence, and so we proceed to Bretonnian turn 1. Given Steve has been as aggressive as he has been, I feel as though I've got no real option but to fight fire with fire. My turn gets off to a great start as the Green Knight turns up at the first time of asking. Now of course, in placing in the wood and going into the side of the dragon would be a perfectly reasonable charge, if the Chaos Lord doesn't have a magic weapon. Or at least a magic weapon that's seriously going to inconvenience me. Now of course, this is one of these occasions where having closed lists is absolutely vital. If I was confident that Steve's dragon's rider wouldn't just kill my Green Knight, I'd charge the beast in the flank by bursting out of the forest. Now of course, in these 2-day events, especially if there's been socialization after day 1, many players will have clocked on to what magic items are on each other's characters. In such a hero hammer focused game as Old World, this information is of course absolutely vital. However, I have no intelligence as to what items Steve has got on his dragon. However, just an instinct tells me that he's probably going to have the biggest, nastiest magic sword he can possibly fit on him, which is probably likely to be the Ogre Blade. If that is the case, all the more reason to not send the Green Knight against him, and all the more reason to put Claude Vollier against him because he's got Syrian's Locket. Right, having got that dragon theorisation out of the way, let's come to what I actually did in my turn. Well, the first thing I do is charge off that dog unit that Steve has put in front of me with my Blue Knight of the Realm unit. Now, that piece of chaff of course has meant that those knights aren't going to be able to get out of the way of the dragon, so he's going to have something to charge. Anticipating this, Fleur casts Lady's Gift on the blue unit. That's going to give them some much needed survivability if that dragon does indeed accept that charge. The next thing I do is place the Green Knight on the hill in Steve's deployment zone and flank charge one of the Shartaks. I'm all over charging the Chosen Knights. However, they of course do have magic weapons and they're going to have fixed combat resolution of at least +2. I think the Green Knight will lose that duel in a grind out. The Chosen Knights also aren't particularly threatening me from where they are. However, shortly after this I began to worry if I've made a mistake. I think the Green Knight is quite close to being able to be seen by those Chosen Knights on the hill. I'm going to have to at least push that Dragon Ogre Shartak back. If he pushes me back, I'm going to be in trouble. I make several other Pegasus-related charges. The first is the 3-man unit on the left-hand side of the battlefield, who spur their winged mounts into a charge on these Cornate Chaos Knights. I have very little respect for these troops. I think they're going to be toast in the combat phase. Next I charge Repanse and those 3 Pegasus Knights into those Forsaken in the tower. Hopefully I can clear those off and then plant my own Squire unit in it coming up from behind. Meanwhile, I position my other 2 Knight Wedges so they can see those Forsaken and that Shartak in front of them. While Core Knights might not be up to much in Warhammer the Old World, I do think that they have a realistic chance of being able to charge off those Forsaken and that single Shartak. That becomes still doubly true in the shooting phase, as a wind blast from Fleur and a few arrows from the Squires drop 2 Forsaken from the unit in front of the green and yellow Knight Wedge. My other piece of movement is to sweep Claude Vollier around to face the front of the dragon. I decide to try and learn from being craven in my previous games. At the end of the day, this should be a heroic encounter that I want competitively. My Duke's equipment is, I believe, ideally suited to taking on this Chaos Lord. There's no point joining the Boy Scouts and being prepared if you're not actually going to go camping. Right, on to the results of these combats. So on the left-hand flank we have the charge of my Pegasus Knights against the Cornate Chaos Knights. I managed to drop 2 of the riders and they do 1 wound to me. The Pegasi win combat by 1 and the Chaos Knights give ground. That actually wasn't a great combat for me really. I was hoping to do rather better than that with my charge. I've also potentially exposed myself to a flank charge from that Forsaken picket line, although Steve is going to need to show a 6 to get it. In the central combats involving my Green Knight and the Pegasi attacking the tower, we experience mixed fortunes. The Green Knight's luck is in and he manages to cleave apart the Shartak, doing 4 wounds with his Dolorous Blade. Of course there's a winner's bonus on offer for this good fortune, because the champion of Bretonia ploughs into the second. Against the Forsaken in the tower, we fight badly. All my Pegasus Knights attacks, and those of Repanse, plus all of the Pegasi, all either miss or fail to wound the Forsaken in an absolute maelstrom of terrible dice rolling. Steve rolls the AP2 mutation, and that's enough to bring down one of the Pegasus Knights. Given this inconclusive combat, I am pushed out of the building. Right, moving on to Chaos Turn 2, and this scintillating game was already reaching a climactic moment. I have a feeling that by the time we've both had our next turn, the game will more or less be decided. So Steve goes hell for leather and charges more or less everything he can. Steve's dragon isn't going to die wandering, and the earth tremors with a blood-curdling roar as the beast ploughs into the young Duke. It's going to be mutually assured destruction time, as I also press the red button and my nuclear rocket flies into Steve's. Meanwhile, Steve's Forsaken gets some juicy charges off. The first is that 4-man unit into Repanse, which is going to be a scary time in the combat phase if they can show a killing blow. The other is on the left-hand flank as the Dark Gods smile on Steve's dice and he gets the 6 he needs to crash into the side of those Pegasus Knights. I think that unit's going to be toast. Finally, you can see that Steve moves his Shartak up to this awkward point between the red and the green Knight units. Quite frankly, I've got no idea really how to resolve this situation if these Knight units want to charge. They can see the Dragon Ogre Shartak because they can actually draw an arc of visibility from their second rank, but they can't actually place into him. For magic, Steve cast a Phantasmagoria in the middle of the battlefield, which is an extremely convoluted and complex spell, but it didn't amount to anything on this occasion. He also manages to get a Battle Lust on the Dragon Ogre Shartak fighting the Green Knight, because he's not in range of anything better. There's also quite a successful fireball from the Chaos Sorcerer on the hill. He aims it at the Pegasus Knights, and does well to inflict 3 wounds. There's just one rider there now, with a single wound remaining. In the combat phase, the Forsaken, who charged the Pegasus Knights, roll badly. They get a poison on the random mutation table, and while that's not bad, it's probably the least useful against Knights. They only bring one of the Pegasi down, although I can't do anything to him in return. I'm lucky with the break test, and the Pegasi only give ground. We now turn to the combat, featuring my 3 heroes. First we'll deal with Repanse. She's fighting this unit of 4 Forsaken. With her Virtue of the Ideal, she's throwing 4 attacks, and she impales 2 of the mutated Chaos Warriors, with the Royal Pegasus kicking down a third. The remaining Forsaken fails to get the Killing Blow mutation, and isn't able to damage Repanse. He uses his Stubborn to fall back in good order, and Repanse restrains and reforms. I'm optimistic one of my archers will be able to finish that single Forsaken off. Next we come to the Green Knight, and once again I'm lucky. With a horrible ripping putrid sound, the Dolorous Blade severs Ogre forequarters from Draconic hindquarters, and the creature is destroyed. We then come with beating hearts and beating drums to the charge of the mighty Chaos Lord on the Dragon and the countercharge of the young Duke. It's Hero Wing Wang showcase time, and it's time to reveal our magic items. Steve reveals that he's got the Enchanting Aura, which means that his dragon is going to be going first. He also reveals that he has the Ogre Blade, and then I counter that by telling him about Surian's Locket, something he had suspected. The mutated dragon and its rider, in a flurry of horrible claws and appendages, rip 2 wounds from the young Duke. For his part, the brilliant young man steers his lance too far to the left and misses the dragon's heart, just catching it a glancing blow and doing it a wound. The Duke is beaten in combat by 2 and uses his Stubborn to fall back. Sensing it's getting on the front foot, the Chaos Dragon surges forward to seal the deal in the next turn. Right into Bretonnian turn 2, and my prediction about this careering to a premature conclusion seems to be coming true. Perspiring as rapidly as I was, I neglected to take a picture of this turn, so I'm going to have to describe. My turn begins with Fleur casting the Lady's Gift on the young Duke to give him some help against that dragon. The rest of my movement phase is primarily dictated by defensive calculations. My Green Knight unit makes a very messy, arguable and disordered charge against that Dragon Ogre Shartak that put itself in that awkward position between the 2 triangles. Aside from that, my Green Knight charges those chosen knights, as much to keep them occupied as anything else. The Blue Knight unit, meanwhile, move backwards. The solitary survivor of the central Pegasus Knight unit takes to the skies and flies behind that wrecked pirate ship to try and save his points. Repanse, meanwhile, takes a bit of a risk and charges the Forsaken in the tower. In the combat phase, the Pegasus Knights who are fighting the Forsaken and the remaining Cornate Chaos Knights fight a bit better and bring down 2 Forsaken. However, the combined Chaos units also bring down a Pegasus Knight, and they win by 1 by virtue of their flank. This time the Pegasus Knights fail their break test and flee off the board. In the disordered charge of the Green and Yellow Knights against the Shartak, my lance is blunted. However, my knights still manage to wound the creature once, and it completely misses with its attacks in return. We beat it by 2 on static combat res. It breaks, flees, and we run it down. Repanse, meanwhile, fights well against the Forsaken in the tower and manages to impale 3 of them. The remaining Forsaken does finally get that Killing Blow mutation, but he can't land his attacks. Steve isn't rolling well with these Forsaken. He could reasonably be expected to get, I think, a lot more than he has, given the amount of dice that he's thrown. Right, now it's on to the Duke. The dragon and its rider don't fight well, and the Duke drops just a single wound. It's just as well for the Duke that his pulpy teenage love interest Surian gave him that locket in that orchard several years ago when he kissed her under the tree, for without it it'd now currently be in 4 pieces, because 2 of the 3 wounds he's taken came from the Ogre Blade. Now the Duke of daring deeds and snappy comebacks steps up to the mark and rolls 2 hits against the dragon. One of the dice comes up a 1, but the other one continues to spin all the way into Steve's deployment zone. Wouldn't it be hilarious after all that build-up if that one spinning dice came out something other than a 6? But it doesn't, punks, and Steve's dragon is decapitated and sent to heaven to be buried alongside Joby's. All of this was so dramatic that I forgot to tell you what happened to the Green Knight. Well, he impaled one of the Chosen and they did a wound back to him. The Green Knight loses combat by 2 and crumbles down to a single wound. However, he's done enough. He's pinned them there. On Steve's turn 3, there's not really that much he can do. His Chaos Sorcerer runs out to the hill and tries to firebomb off some of my knights. He does a couple of wounds, but it seems relatively inconsequential. On the flank, his Forsaken and his Cornate Chaos Knights, which delivered him really his solitary victory of the game so far, skirt down to the table edge, as much to preserve their points as anything else. There's not really much more for him, and we go on to my turn 3. Claude Vollier and Repanse are both loose, and they both charge the Chosen who are fighting the Green Knight. The Knights of the Realm in blue also get into the mix, providing a little bit of core unit action. My Peasant Bowman and one of my units of Squires in the middle of the board managed to ping off the solitary Forsaken that Repanse had engaged earlier. In the combat phase, those Chosen Knights are facing 1,000 points of Bretonnian hero real estate. They are smashed from all 4 sides and completely obliterated. There's not really much more to say about this game. Fleur wind-blasted the solitary Forsaken left in the tower, and the mutated Chaos Warrior is blown from its window. In my subsequent turn, my Peasant Bowmen step into the fortified structure to claim it and win me 300 victory points on the objective. Almost as an after-party, my heroes go hunting the Chaos Sorcerer. I don't know what happened to him in the end, but suffice to say there's one more casting opportunity for the Headless Horseman. Right, so the game ended, and it was another thumping 20-0 victory to the Bretonnians. Simply put, my general killed Steve's, and Steve's general didn't kill mine. I'm afraid trying to analyse it much more than that would probably be foolish. Suffice to say though, I think Steve made the following calculation. He thought that his Chaos Lord's combination of magic items probably gave him the chance of taking down the Duke in 2 turns. I think he also thought this was probably a risk he had to take. His army was very elite and there were plenty of other targets which would have been very vulnerable to the Duke if the dragon hadn't gone for him. I tend to agree, I think it was a risk he had to take. While it was dramatic, I hope I don't sound overly negative in being cynical when Warhammer is reduced to just this, to see which hero kills the other. It's not even as though Steve's dragon could possibly have outmaneuvered my Duke because of his 360-degree vision arc. If I wanted it, it was always a fight that was going to have to happen, and Steve took that option away from me by declaring that charge himself. As it transpired though, the gamble didn't work. Aside from this duel between the heroes, there was of course also another battle that took place between the rank and file troops. I do think in this game Steve was a little bit unlucky, especially with his Forsaken. Only on one occasion where there was a single Forsaken fighting did he manage to roll a Killing Blow mutation. A few more of those in the right places could have spelled doom for more Pegasus Knights and indeed Repanse. So now I've got 69 points out of a possible 80, and I'm on table 1 for the final round. I was in exactly the same place in round 5 in the last Triple Crown Grand Tournament, and things rather went wrong. Maybe it'll be different this time. So, on to the final round. I'm up to table 1, and with it a great chance of winning an Old World tournament at the first time of asking. So, 2 things stand out. The first is that my opposition in this final round is virtually a mirror match. It's a very similar Bretonnian list to mine. It's got Pegasus Knights, it's got Knights of the Realm, it's got 2 Pegasus heroes. It's also got no foot infantry whatsoever apart from the compulsory Peasant Bowman block. And oh, surprise, surprise, someone else is here. And that's Claude Vollier's twin brother. Not only was his twin brother separated from him at birth and looks absolutely identical, he also has exactly the same equipment. He's also been to the same armory where the Grommel Greathelm was produced. He's also been to the same aerial equine diner and purchased the Royal Pegasus. He's also gone on a heroic quest and obtained the virtue of heroism. And most disturbingly, it also seems that he's been snogging Syrian in the orchard, and she's also given him her locket. This battle is about more than mere honour, more than fraternal rivalry. It's about the defence of Bretonnian aristocratic virginity. Well, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, punks, but it's going to be a battle to the death of heroes in the Hall of Mirrors. The second noteworthy point is my opponent himself. This is no grizzled old veteran standing here at table 1, but a young man of just 15 years of age. Never before in the old world would two Bretonnian armies have been facing each other on Table 1 in the final round of a tournament in 8th edition. Never before also would the final analysis be waged between anything other than those who were long in the tooth with many scars. But that was then. This is now. So let's have a chat about my opponent Jack's army. So he's got, as I say, a very similar Bretonnian list to mine, but there are some important differences. First of all, he's got no battle standard bearer in his list. Instead, his secondary Pegasus hero is a Baron. This Baron has the Ogre Blade and the virtue of Knightly Temper, which means he hits like an absolute truck on the charge. However, he does only have 4 wounds and a 3-up armor save. The next major difference is a large unit of Grail Knights. Now these are of course the creme de la creme of heavy cavalry in the Bretonnian list and indeed arguably in the game. They've got countercharge and also fantastic statistics. Personally, I don't really believe in them. I think they're too many points for what they do, and they only have a 3-up armor save. However, against me, I do think that they are quite effective, because they're going to easily be able to beat any of my own lance wedges, because they've got countercharge and much higher initiative. This comparative Grail Knight advantage is also further compounded on a Bretonnian versus Bretonnian matchup. On these occasions, the lady turns her back on both armies and won't grant us the blessing. But Grail Knights get the blessing regardless all the time. They've got a big advantage in offense, a big advantage in defense, and are going to strike first. I'm going to have to avoid that unit unless I can get it in the side. The advantage that I do think I have in this game is the Green Knight. Now of course, either of Jack's heroes, the Baron or Claude Vollier's twin brother, will be able to charge the champion of Bretonnia off with relative ease. But against all of his normal knights, I think that the man in green could be extremely useful, get in the way and pin some of his blocks. On paper, I do think this matchup is slightly loaded against me, although I really think it could go either way. There is, however, one slightly greater advantage that Jack does have, which becomes obvious in his first turn, which is that he has the Falcon Horn of Fredimund. Now, the Falcon Horn is an absolutely cookie-cutter magic measure item for the Bretonnians. If you can pass a leadership test with it, then it stops the whole of the enemy army using their fly moves. I've got loads of Pegasi, so I fully expect that for most of the game, Jack will be able to fly and I'll remain grounded. That's a key disadvantage. That being said, Pegasus Knights are perhaps not the most vulnerable things to the Falcon Horn in the game, because the Pegasi have actually still got move 8 even if we don't fly. The greater disadvantage, though, is that we're going to be landlocked. When you're trying to get out of the way of 360-degree characters, of which Jack has 2 super powerful ones rather than just 1, it's going to be very difficult to do that. Another factoid must be considered here in the mix. I asked Jack how many points he's carrying in from his other games, and he says he's got 73. That's 4 points more than me. That means I'm going to have to beat him by a margin of at least 4 points and ideally 5 to be able to finish ahead of him in this tournament. I can't really bunker up and try and go for a skinny win. That's not really going to be enough. Jack, meanwhile, does have that option, but he would be vulnerable to a heavy win from a player on Table 2 or Table 3, potentially leapfrogging him. To be honest, I probably need to go for the Duke versus Duke combat and hope I roll a 6 and Jack doesn't. Perhaps this would be a fitting send-off to the way the old world ecosystem has evolved so far. Dragon slaying armies of men, and then Dragon Slayer slaying dragon. And now, Dragon Slayer versus Dragon Slayer in a battle without dragons. Right, onto magic, and Jack has done something with his prophetess that I should have done, which is bring battle magic. He gets Fireball, Arcane Urgency, Pillar of Fire, and the Oaken Shield. I get Windblast, Travel Mystical Pathway, the Lady's Gift, and the useless Summon Elemental Spirit. For the second game in a row, Fleur fails to roll Plague of Rust against an almost entirely metallic opposition. Now, there are some mission considerations in this game, and that this is the flanking force scenario. Essentially, we have to put 2/3 of our army in the centre of the battlefield, and then send the other 1/3 round on either the right or left flanks. These are written down in secret and then revealed. Now, because there's a hill in Jack's deployment zone on one flank, I think I'm pretty certain where he's going to drop his flanking force, because he doesn't want them being charged by the Green Knight. This enables me to slightly get the advantage over him, I think, in deployment, because I know which side he's dropping on. So as you can see, he puts all of his night wedges in the centre along with his 2 heroes. I put all of my Knight wedges on the left-hand side of the battlefield, including my Pegasus Knights. I also like the left flank for another reason. There's no impassable terrain in the middle of the table for me to play with, but that light brown ruin up there on the top to the left is pretty much as good as it gets. I think I'll be able to place some of my characters behind that and potentially hide from Jack. In a battlefield with almost no terrain in the middle, it's very difficult to hide from 360-degree heroes, or, to be honest, by definition impossible. That brown ruin there really represents my main chance of achieving that. Now, I have to admit I'm caught in two minds about something, and I think, to be honest, Jack is as well. I don't think either of us just want to charge our dukes into each other and just see who rolls a 6 first. It's just a bit too depressing to reduce the final game of the tournament on table 1 to just that. So, it's a genuine dice-off to see who gets the first turn, because neither of us can pray, and I win it. The first big roll of my game is a bad one, and the Green Knight doesn't show. To be honest, this completely changes the whole way that I play my turn 1. Because I've not got the Green Knight there, I decide I can't really push, and so I keep more or less my whole army anchored in my deployment zone, away from the maximum charge range of those two Pegasus heroes. The only thing I do is use Claude Vollier to fly up by the side of that tower with the Lady's Gift on him. I think I can see a little bit of an opportunity there. There are some Pegasus Knights and a single Knight of the Realm unit, which is part of Jack's flanking force. I think I can use the Duke and my own Pegasus Knights to destroy those, and potentially use that piece of impassable terrain as cover. Although it's almost insignificant, I do actually have a bit more shooting than Jack does, and so I might be able to damage him a little at range. My 2 units of squires and my peasant bowmen all fire at his mounted yeoman, and we manage to unhorse all 5 of the unit. They were literally a cushion waiting to have pins stuck in them, but that's the first serious gain that my shooting has been able to achieve in the whole tournament. Jack is also very cautious in his own turn 1 and doesn't move up very much. However, I do think such caution does have a calculation behind it. Remember, he's 4 tournament points here ahead at the top of the tournament leaderboard, and so he can probably afford to hang back a bit. Right, my turn 2 feels like my real turn 1, and the Green Knight thunders out of a bush on that hill at the top of the battlefield. However, he finds that he's got the Baron there, covering that flank. I can't afford for the Green Knight to be charged by the Baron. The Baron's got the Ogre Blade and the Virtue of Knightly Temper, and he's going to chop the Green Knight to bits. Therefore, instead of charging, I run the Champion of Bretonnia behind the Grail Knights, which prevents him being seen by either the Baron or the Duke. I should say at the beginning of his turn, Jack had also blown the Falconhorn, and so now I know that my flyers aren't really going to be particularly functional. The rest of my turn, and indeed Jack's next turn, once again feel like a Mexican standoff, with us both being afraid of our massive long charges and our 360-degree characters. Jack does put in some aggression, however, and that Grail Knight wedge sweeps towards my empty centre, threatening the sides of my lances, which are cramped up here in the corner. His unit of Knights of the Realm on the left-hand side of the battlefield also boldly advance into my lion's mouth, but his Pegasus Knights hang back. The peasant bowmen, meanwhile, scoot to the side of that impassable terrain feature. The 2 Knight wedges in front of my Green Knight hang back a bit. They do at least stop the Champion of Bretonnia charging anything. I think again this is a calculation. Jack's decided that there's no point turning units round to face the Green Knight. Fundamentally, it'll be a question of a unit holding against the Green Knight and challenging him out with a unit champion, and then him either putting his Duke or his Baron in as a reply. So, on to my turn 3, and this is where the battle starts getting spicier. So the first thing I do is declare some charges with my Green Knight. Now, another piece of icing on the many-layered Green Knight cake is of course that he causes terror. Terror is particularly dangerous in Old World because that test can't be re-rolled using the BASB, you just run. It's also dangerous because troops take that terror test at the moment the charge reaction is declared, thus meaning that if a unit flees, it actually moves then. This is much more of a semi-throwback to the way things worked in 8th edition. As veteran players will know, in that edition, you declared a charge and then I declared my reaction and we passed from one to the other. In Old World, it isn't like that. You declare all your charges and then your opponent declares all his charge reactions. This isn't the case with Terror, though. You literally just flee at the moment the charge is declared, which means that you can potentially also charge fleeing troops if one does fail a Terror test. This is exactly what happens, and the first Knight of the Realm unit that the Green Knight charges screams its head off in terror and careers towards the centre of the battlefield. Unfortunately for Jack, these knights flee directly in front of one of my squire pickets. This little unit is then able to declare a charge at these fleeing knights right under their noses and easily hack them down. In 8th Ed, of course, they would have fled again, but not in Old World. The only silver lining for Jack here is that the Green Knight fails his redirection test and isn't able to charge the second Knight of the Realm unit in front of him. On the left-hand side of the battlefield, I think I've got a good chance, and my Pegasus Knights spur their mounts into a gallop against the Knights of the Realm unit in front of them. Of course, Jack has seen this coming long ago and elects to flee with his Knights of the Realm, and they bounce through the peasant bowmen standing behind them. Their lordly masters ploughing through their ranks, however, is too much for the rabble to take, and they also run screaming towards the table edge. However, there's no escape from Claude Vollier from those 3 Pegasus Knights. They're too close to the table edge, and they instead elect to countercharge the young Duke. The combat phase is not a good one for me. Claude Vollier completely misses with all his attacks against the Pegasus Knight unit champion, and the Pegasus Knights actually beat him by 1. The Duke is forced to use his stubborn to fall back in good order, and the Pegasus Knights pursue him. Now I have had a little bit of luck with the arrangement of this impassable terrain piece. While I was playing for this to some extent, many of my failed charges and the Duke's retreat against those Pegasus Knights have actually placed me behind this ruined desert-like building here, which has limited Jack's options for any funky charges with his own Duke. Anyway, in his turn 3, his Knights of the Realm and his peasant bowmen both rally. Jack's own view with his Duke is blocked by the building, and so he declares one of those funky backwards old world 360-degree charges with his Duke. His target is the Green Knight. To be honest, I don't mind this. The champion of Bretonnia is probably going to be beheaded, but unlike Steve's dragon, unlike Joby's dragon, unlike Joby's demon prince, unlike Joby's giant, and probably another host of celebrities from his previous games, the Green Knight can place his head back on with the avowed cry of "'Tis but a scratch!" Here you can see the rest of Jack's movement. The Grail Knight squadron continue to advance on my red and my blue units of knights and Fleur, cutting a wedge between my 2 skirmishing units of peasants. The Baron takes the place of the Duke before he charged the Green Knight, and it's he now who is exerting this threat. That being said, he's also using that piece of impassable terrain to hide from my own units. Right in the combat phase, Claude Vollier's evil twin brother slams into the Green Knight. He can't show a heroic killing blow, but damages the champion of Bretonnia to the tune of 2 wounds. The Pegasus also stamps him for another, and cue a little debate about whether the Royal Pegasus also gets magic attacks as conferred by the Grail Vow. In the end, while we're waiting for a TA ruling of this, we roll for the Green Knight to see what would have happened anyway. As it transpires, the Dolorous Blade completely misses, and whether or not the Pegasus attacks were counted as magical or not comes to nothing because the Green Knight collapses. There's better news for me, though, in the combat phase with Claude Vollier. With a combination of Revolutionary Tribunal and Judge Dredd, the young Duke declares this Pegasus Knight unit champion to be a traitor to the land of Bretonnia. He is sentenced to death and beheaded. This is too much for his 2 friends, and they break and flee, and the Duke runs them all down in a sea of red gore. I think things are looking quite good for me as we go on to Bretonnia in turn 4. I've destroyed 3 units and haven't lost anything in reply. I've got a Knight of the Realm unit on top of my Pegasus Knights and Claude Vollier, the ones that rallied earlier, and I spur my Pegasi into them to chase them off the board. Surely that's going to be another easy gain for me. Things get still better for the real noble Bretonnians as the Green Knight turns up once again immediately and places in the forest. He's got just enough gas to be able to charge those Grail Knights in the side, and he goes and makes it. I've managed to see off one of the principal threats to Fleur and those 2 units of Knights of the Realm in my deployment zone. I'm feeling very confident now. I enjoy another moment of good fortune. Jack had actually cast a Pillar of Fire with the Prophetess in his Grail Knight unit, and had managed to place that in front of my 2 Knights of the Realm unit. He needed a 6 with the multiple scatter, but he got it, and it bounced through both Knight units and Fleur. Now, of course, the way Pillar of Fire distributes damage makes it excellent at destroying those old world style wizards who tend to hang around near units. However, I get really lucky as the main damage the Pillar of Fire meets out is on the Blue Knight unit where I can spare some men. Fleur, meanwhile, doesn't take any damage and just emerges with an Essex Girl style suntan. Things have been going well for me in this tournament, and indeed in this game. The lady has been smiling on me, and I don't need to enjoy her favour very much longer to end up in the winner's paddock. However, she has other plans for me in this turn. First there's the charge of Claude Vollier and the 3 Pegasus Knights into those hapless Knights of the Realm. These knights can't even countercharge. However, there's always a danger to complacency. Claude and the Pegasus Knights completely, totally and utterly spoon their attacks and do no damage whatsoever to the Knights of the Realm. The enemy Bretonnians meanwhile stab one of the Pegasus Knights and makes it drop a wound. Unbelievably, they win combat by 2 and force Claude Vollier and the Pegasus Knights to both give ground. Claude's pushed forward, and he can see his twin brother there looking evilly at him from the centre of the table. Now we move on to the charge of the Green Knight, who has of course caught the Grail Knights in the flank, and now it's my turn to be screwed over by the new rules. So the Green Knight swings and dispatches one of the Grail Knights. While these noble knights do have magical attacks, there are only 2 of them fighting the Green Knight, and they're not able to damage him. And then the Steed of Shadows, the Green Knight's mysterious horse, on whom the fluff says nothing, also decides to attack. It takes an irrational dislike to these Grail Knights who have already succeeded on their Grail quest and smashes one of them from the saddle. This makes the difference between the Grail Knights drawing combat, which would have kept them anchored there, and them losing combat by 1. The Grail Knights use their stubborn to fall back in good order, and then I discover the fatal consequences of what has happened. Because those squires are there next to the side of the Grail Knights actually bounce through them, or they do lose one of their knights through a peril test. The Green Knight, meanwhile, is not able to pursue because he'd hit the squires. The Grail Knights automatically rally at the end of the turn and get a free reform. They're spat out of this trampoline series right next to Fleur and my units of Knights of the Realm that are bunkering down in my deployment zone. It's Jack's turn next, and it's going to be carnage. The Grail Knights have been flank charged, lost combat, and broken. They've also been chased through some of my own units, and have ended up with a wonderfully beneficial outcome. That's the perversity of the fall back in good order mechanics, punks. I told you that with Linehammer, and this is another. Because you get that free reform, because you get to bounce over units in your way like a flea move, and especially because you can charge after it's completed, a fall back in good order combat result is often much better than a give ground. Right now it's on to Jack's turn 4, and he's got a great chance to get a big swing back in this game because of that fall back in good order. So his Grail Knights without hesitation declare a charge on Fleur. There's absolutely no point me holding to this, because I know he's just going to smash into one of my knight units after he kills her. Accordingly, I elect to flee, and she bounces through the red knight unit but still stays on the board. Jack redirects into that red unit. Again, there's no point holding with them, because he'll smash them apart and then overrun into Fleur and kill her. Thus, I voluntarily flee off the table, because he won't be able to redirect again. However, in Old World, unlike in 8th edition, if you're charging an opponent that fled, you move your full charge distance. Now, some ambiguity of course here emerges. The Knights of the Realm who the Grail Knights are fleeing have fled off the table, and so there's not actually technically any target for us to align centre to centre to. There's no explanation on how you resolve a charge like this when the charging target no longer exists. In the absence of this explanation, we assumed that the Grail Knights went towards the table edge at the place that the Knights of the Realm left. There was then, of course, the tender question of what happened to Fleur. Fairly clearly, at least some of the Grail Knight triangle would miss her as these riders went after my fleeing Knights of the Realm. However, measuring it up with this hypothetical exit point centre to centre, it was absolutely arguable that at least some of the outer parts of the triangle of Grail Knights would clip the Prophetess's base. It's very close, and we call for an adjudication. Eventually we decide that the first Grail Knight will miss Fleur, the second would be arguable, and the third would hit her. This settles the argument, because Jack's charge comes out super high, and it's comfortably enough for the outer corner of the Grail Knight triangle to hit Fleur. The fair Prophetess and a knight unit are both gone, and Jack's come roaring back into the game. Anyway, the Grail Knights reform and face the side of my blue knight unit. My 2 surviving Knight of the Realm units are now going to have to push forward, or they're going to be ended too. Dr. Blaxill was ranting and raving a bit by this point, but his opponent dealt with it with fabulous good humour, and fully agreed with Dr. Blaxill that this was a perverse outcome that you would never have seen in the good old days of 8th edition. Elsewhere in the battlefield, I should say that the Duke decides to not duel his twin brother in a display of fraternal mutual consideration. Instead, he decides to charge the peasant bowman and go after some easy points. The rabble flee, but don't go very far, and the Duke mercilessly butchers all of them. There's better news for me in the north combat though, because the Pegasus Knights and Claude Vollier get their act together against the Knights of the Realm. They kill them all bar one, and the sole survivor breaks from combat. Given he's going to need a double one to rally, we leave him to flee the field in a subsequent turn. In my turn 5, there's not much more to do. My flying executive of the Duke, Repanse and the 3 Pegasus Knights charge into the peasant bowmen to also go after some easy points. Meanwhile, on the southern part of the table, my Pegasus Knights charge Jack's last unit of Knights of the Realm. Meanwhile, my Knights move up out of the charge arc of those Grail Knights. The combat phase sees me dispatch all bar one of the peasant bowmen and once again leave the sole survivor to flee the field. The Pegasus Knights fight well against the Knights of the Realm and unhorse 3 of them. The remainder flee and run through that stone monolith, losing another one of their number from dangerous terrain. However, they're able to rally in Jack's next turn and cower behind the terrain feature to save their points. I will summarise the remainder of this game. In Jack's next turn, the Baron charges the Green Knight and flashes his Ogre Blade and once again severs the champion of Bretonnia's head. Unfortunately for me, in the remaining 2 turns of this game, the Green Knight doesn't have it in him to come back for a 3rd time. The last rites of this game see me make a calculated charge on the Baron with my Green and Blue Knight units. Of course he can countercharge and he's got the virtue of the knightly temper. The Knights together manage to score a single wound against the Baron, who decapitates only 1 knight in reply. We beat him in combat by 3, he breaks and we run him down. That doesn't happen very often in Warhammer the Old World, core units defeating a hero, so savour it. Right at the end of this dramatic and brutal game, in the final analysis it finished a 10-10 draw. I think I had the wind behind me for most of this game and was looking good for a skinny win. Even if I'd got that though, I'm not sure it would have been enough to have closed the gap that my opponent had over me on the tournament leaderboard. I should say that I think Jack played extremely well. Make no mistake, this was no 15-year-old simply using a filthy list in a broken game. He knew the rules like the palm of his hand and made excellent tactical decisions. Moreover, the way he thought about the game, the way he considered hypothetical possibilities, the way he communicated what he was doing, and the cunning eye that he kept on table 2 to see what was unfolding in that other game were first class. I tried my best, but I wasn't able to beat him. After this, I must admit I was rather rooting for Jack to win the tournament. The auguries from table 2 look rather good for that. One of those Tomb King armies is on it, and it looks like another grind fest, which is probably also finished in a draw. I also hear from table 3, where my friend Simon is playing, that game also has finished in a dead heat. I was in Jack's position in the previous Triple Crown Grand Tournament, where I was on top of the leaderboard in Game 5. I only got a 10-10 draw in that game, and several tables lower than me scored big wins and I got bunted down to 3rd place. However, this doesn't happen this time, and with 3 draws on the top 3 tables, Jack walks away as the worthy winner. This stalemate on tables 2 and 3 also has the effect of ensuring that I finish 2nd, and I walk away with the silver trophy to go with the bronze one I won last year. Right, time for a brief closing evaluation. First, I should say that despite my criticisms of Warhammer the Old World, which have laced these videos and I realise will not be to everyone's taste, I had a fantastic time and had 5 fantastic games of Warhammer Fantasy. These were real games of Warhammer Fantasy, not some kind of ersatz replacement, not some kind of cardboard cutout, not some kind of low-fat substitution. I'll say a little more at the end about some of my general thoughts about where we're at with Warhammer the Old World, but first I'll do a little evaluation of my army. So let's start with the heroes first and foremost, because that was really where it's at. First of all, let's start with the young Duke Claude Vollier. Whoa man, what a tournament! I think he accounted for about 4,000 points of my opponent's armies throughout these 5 rounds and was never taken casualty in return. Now of course he had a lot of high value targets to go against, and that was what he was built to take down. However, he was also quite good against non-monstrous targets too, and was really useful even in auxiliary combats. Even in the games where he didn't kill his opposite number, he more or less cancelled him out. He stopped Chris using his dragon properly in Game 2, and stopped Jack using his own Duke properly in Game 5. He does have a few vulnerabilities, but they weren't in the opposition that I faced. Certainly the Beastman spell Viletide, or anything that's generically got Killing Blow, Both of these things would give the young Duke some pause to think. The traditional way, of course, of dealing with big heroes and monsters is artillery. But in Old World, that doesn't really do very much damage, and you also still get armor against it and regen. For that reason, I saw very few artillery pieces on any of the high tables. Quite frankly, I can't think of any competitive reason why I wouldn't include the Duke in exactly the form I picked him in this tournament. Next we move on to the Green Knight, and he was also absolutely incredible. The fact that he's able to charge on the turn that he appears. The fact that we were getting through all 6 turns because we only had 2,000 points instead of 2,500, both of these also greatly increased the influence of the man in green. He also has got that 360-degree charge arc, and so he's very hard to hide from. Now, it is true that in a Hero Hammer-centric edition, any hero Rotha's Salt should be able to dispatch the Green Knight fairly easily, but that still means he can pin things, it still means he can fight all sorts of other troops. The list of uses of the Green Knight is literally as long as if you rolled a piece of paper all the way from the shores of Estala all the way to the Empire. He is incredible. Next we've got Repanse. In games where most of the time I was either winning heavily or avoiding my opponent, Repanse didn't do as much fighting as she might otherwise would. She tended mainly to just get involved helping the Pegasus Knights or teaming up with the Green Knights. She was an incredibly useful support piece. In subsequent games, I've actually started experimenting with a slightly different build for her. This involves giving her a War Banner, the Virtue of Duty and the Gauntlet of the Duel. This means she brings in +3 combat resolution and challenges she issues can't be refused. And then finally we come to Fleur, my prophetess. I'm afraid magic in the Old World is really rather boring, and sometimes I struggle to remember moments where it was particularly decisive, and so it doesn't feature as much in these battle reports as it would have done in my 8th ed content. However, Fleur was perfectly respectable. The fact that my army was able to push the opponents back meant that she was often able to advance into the middle of the battlefield, where she was able to perform her primary function of attempting to stop enemy spells. As for her magic, well, Plague of Rust is the star spell from Elementalism, and I didn't get it in 2 of my games where it would have been very useful. I have to admit, I don't think it did very much, but on another day I think it would have done. Wind Blast, however, was extremely useful, and I was able to use the push function of that spell on a number of occasions to reasonable effect. The Lady's Gift was useful, although a little bit marginal. It does only have a short range after all, and the rest of the spells from Elementalism were all so useless that I don't think I ever bothered casting them. As I said in one of my reports, I think that Battle Magic would have been a better choice for her. There are more of the spells there that are actually useful, and less of the bum ones. Right, moving on to my units, and let's start with the 2 units of Pegasus Knights. Well, they were extremely useful. They did a lot of heavy fighting, they were often able to take down targets from my opponent's special and rare category. Short of fighting enemy heroes, I think that they could take on most of the things my opponent had, and with supreme speed and maneuverability. To be honest, I really think that if you could jam a 3rd unit of Pegasus Knights in there, get rid of all of the squires, and then maybe make a few cuts to some of the characters, that might be an even more powerful version of this army, although an even more depressing one. And then we come to the Knights of the Realm. Well, look, my expectations for them was pretty limited, but I think I got them more or less right. I like the fact that the 3 lances could reinforce each other, and sometimes when 2 lances charged together, as we saw in the 3rd game against Ryan's Lizardmen, as we saw in the 5th game against Jack's Baron, sometimes they could bring home the bacon. They weren't strong, and I wouldn't have them unless I was forced to have them by dint of them being core units, but at the same time they weren't bad. As for the squires, well, I was a little bit disappointed with them, I have to say. I think the main function of little units like this is to get in the way of opposition. But of course, many of the threats in Old World fly. There aren't very many big Death Stars for a little unit to get in the way of that you want to keep out of your hair, and so they were less useful than you might think. Perhaps 3 games is too small a sample size, and they have been more useful in some practice games, however. Right, let me say a few more general things. The more I play of Warhammer the Old World, the more convinced I am that there are huge competitive problems with this game. I think paying for your wheel out of a charge just creates arguments. I don't think the skirmisher rules are functional. I think the compulsory overruns straightforward just create an absolute random fruit salad. However, I think it gets much worse than this when you consider the meta. The meta game is now extremely flat for Warhammer the Old World. As you can see from my 5 games, the whole thing is about massive heroes. It's not just because the heroes are too strong relative to other things, which they are, it's that they're so hard to avoid. Almost all of them fly, and those that have got 360-degree vision arcs are just about impossible to avoid. Speaking objectively, the 2 best games of fantasy I played in this tournament were my 2nd and my 5th. In both of these games, myself and my opponent avoided this deathmatch between our generals. Had one of us gone for it, I think they would probably have gone the same way as the other games. The other problem is the complete redundancy of ranked up infantry. The only thing resembling that I saw on any of the top tables was some big Tomb King skeleton blocks, which of course aren't designed to charge and aren't designed to fight. Other than that, guys, I regret to say I can't see any role for ranked up infantry in Warhammer the Old World. If you're going to run fighting infantry, you're either going to have to run them in a line or regenerate into a line at the earliest possible opportunity. And at the moment, that's not better than dragons, skirmishing heroes, skirmishers and magic missile spam. Right, now I've got that whinge out of the way, I will say something a bit more constructive. There is apparently going to be a matched play pack that will be released towards the end of 2024. Perhaps that's going to do something similar for Warhammer the Old World than the General's Handbook did for the first edition of Age of Sigmar. One massive thing they could do in that is the introduction of mission-based play. Now, if they have that and they force you to take standard bearers, unit fortitude in other words, then that might bring back ranked up infantry at least as a mechanism of holding objectives, even if it's not actually going to be doing much fighting. Correspondingly, that might disincentivize big heroes. At my event, the Twin Sentinels, we used 9th Age missions in Warhammer the Old World, and that required you to take fortitude-bearing units to be able to win missions, which had a huge impact on the number of tournament points you could get from the games. In that, we had relatively few dragons, we had much more varied armies, and we had a much more interesting metagame within that comp system. Thus, I do genuinely think that there is real hope for this game to get a lot better. I do think some of the rules, such as the ridiculous way in which they've allowed supporting attacks sideways and step sideways instead of supporting attacks behind and step up, can't really be changed until we get a new edition of the rules. I don't think that magic can be made anything other than extremely boring until we get a new magic system, but I do think most of the things about the game, which are currently reducing the meta to something as flat as what you've seen in these battle reports, can and will be changed. That's why it's not really any good to simply compare this game as it is now to 8th edition. 8th edition by the end was a very mature meta. It had been patched lots of times. All of the ambiguities in the rules had been ironed out. In Old World, this simply hasn't happened yet. There are many ambiguities in these rules. I would argue many more than there ever were in 8th edition, but with several years of vigorous exposure to the ironing board, of Games Workshop issuing sensible FAQs and fans coming to sensible agreements, this game can get a great deal better, and that will be the true comparison to Warhammer editions of the past, when this meta is mature. Then we can have a sensible discussion about whether Old World is better than 6th, better than 8th, or better than any other previous edition. At the moment, that comparison with legendary Warhammer editions of the past is meaningless. Of course this can't stand up to them, but we shouldn't expect it to. It's young and it's unformed, but it does have one key thing going for it, and that's very simply that it's alive and that it can own the future. For me, that argument is the one that eclipses all of the others. Many things were better in the past, and I have no doubt that Warhammer Fantasy was one of them. I'm all for a wander down memory lane or a trip to the museum, and I still fully intend to continue playing all of the old editions that I can find opponents to play me at. Warhammer is extremely nostalgic, but when all is said and done, we must all face the temporal autocracy of the present. When the old world was destroyed, many a smug person was writing the obituary of Warhammer Fantasy. They were wrong then, and whatever its faults, Old World is proving that they're wrong now. Warhammer the Old World is the best supported tabletop wargame on planet Earth in the year 2024. It's not the best of all time, but that's a much higher bar, and probably one that's unreasonable for us to expect it to clear. But who knows, maybe one day, and with our help, it might yet get there.